Hello, everyone. Before we get started with this new episode, I want to give a quick shout out to a couple of the new sponsors of the podcast, the first of which being the Archives of Falconry. If you're not familiar with the Archives of Falconry, they're located in Boise, Idaho, and they're the leading steward of global falconry heritage. The Archives collects and preserves falconry heritage and the legacy of individual falconers, including their correspondence, memorabilia, art, literature, crafts, and life stories. The Archives also interprets falconry history and celebrates the role of falconers in the birth of raptor conservation. If you would, please visit falconry.org and consider becoming a member. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Masters of the Skies, and Masters of the Skies is dedicated to educating the public about native raptors and about falconry in particular. Located in eastern Pennsylvania and traveling all over the northeastern United States, Masters of the Skies offers hands-on interactive raptor experiences to anyone who's interested in birds of prey and falconry. Their educational program can be run in a variety of venues and in multiple languages and has been described as fun and engaging, and consistently receives 5-star reviews online. Masters of the Skies believes that every falconer is also a conservationist, and they're also inspired by falconer-led projects such as the North American Grouse Partnership and the Peregrine Fund. Masters of the Skies also promotes the conservation of our native birds of prey through the practice of falconry and strives to create connections with other institutions that share the same core principles and values, because raptor conservation happens only when we all work together. Masters of the Skies also offers falconry-based bird abatement services all over Pennsylvania. For more information, just head to mastersoftheskies.org, and you can also find them on Facebook and Instagram. I'm very happy to have them on board as new sponsors, and if you're interested in collaborating or becoming a sponsor as well, just send an email to falconrychronicles@gmail.com. Thanks, and let's get on to the show.
With squirrel hawking, the chases can be short sometimes, but typically with a good bird and some good squirrel woods, you're going to get chases that can last up to a half hour to an hour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the new Falconry Chronicles Podcast. I appreciate everyone's patience, and for those of you who are coming over from Falconry Told and continuing to listen to the episodes that I produce, thank you for coming over and for continuing to listen. And for all the new listeners that might be joining us, welcome. I hope you all will continue to enjoy all the new episodes that will be coming out here over the coming months, and hopefully by now some of you will have had a chance to listen to some of the Houndsman XP podcasts that are available, and if you haven't yet, I highly recommend you give that a chance, because those guys are good guys. I'm happy to be working with them now, and they're really involved in hunting conservation, so check it out. But as far as this first episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast goes, I'm just going to give you all a heads up. It's going to be a lengthy one, so strap in. You might have to take some bathroom breaks on this one or something, but I wanted to start off with a bang here, and the voice that you heard in the intro there is the voice of who many consider to be probably one of the first, if not the first, really serious squirrel hawkers in the country, being Gary Brewer. And he was squirrel hawking before it was really considered to be a norm, and sort of whenever it was still kind of considered sort of taboo. And you'll hear about all that and lots of different stories and experiences here in this conversation with Gary. But for those of you that know him or have met him in person, you know that the guy can talk and loves to tell stories. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And thanks again for joining us for this first episode of the Falconry Chronicles podcast with Gary Brewer. Here we go. Continue on with your initial thought of what we were just talking about with falconry being regulated and just the line of thought you're just talking about.
We
here.
have a much better situation today. Mm-hmm. You know, back in the past, say 40 years ago, I mean, it was really regulated. Mm-hmm. I mean, I took a Cooper's hawk to California when I went out there to work a disaster. And this was before 9/11, well before 9/11. This is back in the 80s. a guy had dumped a Cooper's Hawk on me that I really didn't want, but I couldn't take it. I couldn't take it back. I had to go forward with it because he thought that I really wanted to fly an accipiter and just didn't know it, And I've from the day one in falconry, I never wanted to fly anything accipiter I really didn't know what I wanted to fly. But I was not one of these guys that wanted to know a little bit about everything, but not a whole lot about anything. I wanted to be somebody that was good at something, really good at something. I just didn't know what that was at the time. But anyway, I found that back then it would have been easier to have flown out to California with a bazooka than it was to fly out there with a bird of prey. I mean, because I had to get in contact with all the states I flew over, and they didn't give me permission to take the bird on the plane. They just gave me permission to transport it, and of course it was banded. And when I got to Dallas Love Field Airport, that was the airport then, so that'll tell you how long ago it was. But I got to the station where you get x-rayed your bags and whatnot, and there was a policeman leaned up against the wall on one side, and I didn't know really how I was going to get past this, because if something bad went wrong here, I wouldn't make it to California and my job could be in jeopardy. And so, the lady told me to put the bag on the belt. And I said, well, I had this scam. I had all these letters from these different states on state letterhead, saying the bearer of this permit is permitted to transport female Cooper's Hawk, band number, blah, blah, blah. So a very official looking document. And I'd made me a notebook with sheet protectors, really good looking. And I was wearing a 3-piece suit with a big felt cowboy hat and sunglasses, the heap of trouble type sunglasses. And so this is where I've got to initiate my plan. And so I said, well, ma'am, I don't mind running the bag through the x-rays, but I've got a bird in this bag that I really rather not expose to x-rays. You got a bird in that bag? And the guy leaning against the wall kind of stood up. Now his ears are perked up. What's going on? So he comes walking over there and he says, you got a bird in that bag? I said, yes, sir. And he said, what kind of bird is it? And I reached in the bag. I had her in a tube, with a lady's hose pulled over the tube.
More or less an ABBA, type
kind of,
yeah, sort of.
So, but her face was, in one end of that thing, and how them Cooper's Hawks have a nobody's home look, in their eyes. And I showed it to him, and I showed it to her, and he goes, ain't that illegal? And I said, it sure is. I said, if you don't have the right permits, it's a felony. And he says, and I presume you have the right paperwork. And I said, I sure do. And I opened up that. He was flipping through there. This guy didn't even know what falconry was, let alone any legalities that were involved in it. So anyway, he was overwhelmed with state seals, and he says, have you ever done this before? And I looked him straight in the eyes and I took off my sunglasses and I said, I do this all the time. So he goes, well, he shrugged his shoulders and said, well, okay, whatever. So I got away with it. And I took this bird. It was in an athletic bag and I had a 3-man dome tent in there that was going to be my muse. I had a PVC bow perch that I had built and then took it apart and then glue it together. I had 3 turkey necks that were frozen and wrapped in about 6 layers of aluminum foil that was packed around her, so that when I got to my destination, I could just boom, I'm ready to go. So, but then, about 3 months later, and I had a great time with her in California. I mean, if you're going to fly a Cooper's Hawk, San Jose and, a lot of Santa Rosa, a lot of those places up there, they got quail, they got pheasant, they got lots of things for a Cooper's hawk that I really don't have around here, really. So about 3 months passed, and it came to the time now I got to do this same going back, So, Dallas and Oakland are completely different planets, So I get to the security place, and the girl says, put the bag on the belt. So run it through X-ray. And I did the same thing. I said, well, I don't mind running the bag through X-rays, but I've got a bird in that bag. I'd really rather not exposed to X-rays. And she goes, you got a bird in that bag? I said, yeah. She says, I've got a parrot. She started talking about her parrot, and so I just took the bird out and was holding it in my hand and set the bag down. It ran through, and I walked to the other end and just let her run, telling me about her parrots, and then picked up the bag, stick the bird back in it, zip it up, and walked on into the terminal. It wasn't no problem coming back. But anyway, that was a very, very long time ago.
Yeah. And
I'm sure the statutes have run on on all that. But anyway, that story came to mind when we were talking about how strict the falconry regulations were back in the past. And, I got my license just a couple of years before the big sting thing went down, and so, a lot of things changed in falconry. People weren't as friendly. Falconers that you didn't know were not nearly as opened to inviting you into their group. I went to Denver, Colorado for a school, a 30-day school for my job. And, while everybody else was wanting to go skiing and all that kind of stuff on the weekends when we weren't in school, I wanted to get together with some of the local falconers. And I had my NAFA directory with me, and I started calling people, and nobody talked to me. And then I saw Hal Webster's name in there, and I had met him before in Texas at the club one year when he came to speak. So I just worked up the courage, and I dialed his number. Webster here. His way he would answer, and I told him, I said, you probably don't remember me, but he did. He's a super guy. Loved him. And he says, what's up, son? I said, well, I'm in Denver. Oh, hell you are. I said, yes, sir. I said, I really would like to get I'm an out-of-state guy. Nobody knows. Going to be in town for a month, and I want to get to know you, a falconer. This is like a couple of years after the big sting went down, so I said, he says, well, you ought to call some of these guys. I said, well, I've tried. Nobody will talk to me. He said, where you at, son? I told him where I was at, motel room, gave him phone number, room number. He said, sit tight. Don't go nowhere. I said, okay. 10 minutes later, my phone was ringing. That's the kind of guy he was, so I had a lot of fun for, 4 weekends in a row going out with the local Denver people. And, and that began a long relationship between me and Mr. Webster. We became very good friends. He was very supportive and instrumental in my first book being published. I took him squirrel hawking in Abilene one year. He wanted to go, just me and him. Of course, my son was with me. He was maybe 12 or 13 years old then. He's 43 now. It's a long time ago. So I took him to the only place I knew of in Abilene. We're talking in the transition area between the plains and the desert, not exactly squirrel heaven. And but I had found a place a few years before that did hold squirrels. The chases weren't all that great, because there's a hole at the bottom of every tree. And so you either catch it right away or it gets away, kind of thing. So, but he wanted to see squirrel hawking, and I hate it. I hate it when I'm in a place like that and somebody that's never seen squirrel hawking wants me to take them out. I've caught squirrels at every place I've ever been to a meet. In Amarillo, I caught squirrels. Abilene, I caught squirrels. Lubbock, I caught squirrels. I mean, if you can find a source of water and hardwood trees, I mean, there's likely going to be squirrels there. They may not be the monsters that we have here in the forest where I live, and the chases are not going to be spectacular. I mean, to a small degree they might be, but they're not going to be the kind of what I call squirrel hawking. I hate for people to see that glorified rat hunt and think that's what squirrel hawking is all about. But it was Hal Webster. He wanted to go, so I took him. And God was there that day. The stars all lined up. And we got a squirrel chase going. We were almost at the back of the property. Got a squirrel chase going. And it was just amazing that it went as long as it did. It wound up going into a hole in one of these it was an old pecan orchard that had been abandoned. And there were only a few surviving pecan trees, and then there were some scrubby old oak trees and whatnot in there. So, when you get a squirrel chase going in there, it's likely going to be the only one you're going to get, so you got to maximize. And I mean, God was with us that day because it wound up being a really good chase. It wound up going into a hole up in the tree. And so I kicked off my boots and shimmied up into the tree, got up into a fork up there, and I got me a limb. The bird had seen this drill before. So she flies over and she's kind of up over me, watching me curiously as I was poking a stick in this hole. I didn't think for a minute that squirrel was going to come out of there. I didn't think it for a minute. But boom. That squirrel, for some reason, I must have hit her funny bone or something, but she just exploded out of that hole and jumped on my shoulder and then sprung off onto a limb that stretched out towards another old dead stump, that was about 20 foot tall. Hal was on the ground looking up, with his mouth hanging open, and that dead stump was hollow. And so this squirrel obviously was going to try to leap into space and land on the ground near the only hole in that tree that was at the bottom. And if it would have done that, that would have been it. I mean, there was no way we'd have got it out of that big old stump. But the bird was on her toes. And when the squirrel ran out there, just as soon as it sprung in the air, she smacked it in midair. And then, of course, spun down to the ground. Hal had to step out of the way because if they'd have landed right in his face. And then a hell of a fight broke out. So, I got to get down there and help her. I got to secure this catch, because the legend is standing there watching all this. So I just kind of swung down like Tarzan and dropped about 10 or 12 feet to the ground, barefooted. I dropped down right on top of this fracas that was going on the ground, and I got to control the squirrel's head, and I put it down, and then everything kind of calmed, and I backed away and gave the bird a little time, and I looked up at Hal, who looked like he was 10 freaking feet tall, standing there, because I really admired the guy. I mean, he was a pioneer in my eyes of falconry in America, and just a super nice guy. I mean, he was not aloof or he's just a down-to-earth person. And I said, "What'd you think about that, Hal?" He goes, "Boy, would you believe in 50 years of falconry, I ain't never seen nothing like that." And I said, "Well, what'd you think about it?" And I'll clean this up a little bit. He says, "That's the gall-darndest thing I ever saw." So anyway, we got that under control. I transferred the bird. He said, "Son, I've got another appointment this afternoon, and I kind of like to take a nap in the middle of the day." There'd be, he'd go back to the room, take a couple shots of Weller's, and lay down and take him a nap, and then he was good for the afternoon. So I said, okay. He needed to get back to the motel. I said, "But this ain't over. He goes, what you mean, son? I said, we're going to catch a rabbit before we get back to the truck. And he goes, you're pretty sure of yourself, ain't you? I said, well, let's see. So just before we got to the truck, my son went down into a wash and flipped over a pallet, and a cottontail, shot out of there, went up the ravine and out into just a gigantic, about a 2-acre briar patch. And of course, the bird took off and was tracking the rabbit, but didn't go down low. She stayed up high. And then apparently the rabbit thought it was safe and it stopped. And she turned head down, flapped a couple times to get her a little speed, and then folded up, and then bam, whee! That was amazing. Then that sealed our friendship, between Hal and I, and we stayed in touch. Well, after a few years later, I had kind of been shunned, or at least I felt like I was shunned when it dawned on me that if I was going to be successful at falconry, I was going to have to hunt squirrels. I got my general permit. During my 2 years as an apprentice, I had avoided squirrels like the plague because that was what I was instructed to do. In fact, the only time I'd ever seen falconry actually practiced was I went up to a mini meet in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And of course, they hunted rabbits up there. They had them then. I think the rabbit population is not as high now as it used to be. But some guy's red-tail got into a standoff in a little group of trees with a squirrel, and everybody was freaking out. I mean, lures, they were desperate to get this bird down. And that once they got the bird down, I mean, they packed up and moved to a whole nother place. Well, that was the only reaction to squirrels that I had seen in falconry, And so I avoided them for 2 years. I killed one rabbit in 2 years on my territory. I'd have to go to Dallas on a weekend. I'd kill 2 or 3 of them in an hour and a half, So, it just wasn't optimistic to think that if I was going to be successful in falconry, I was going to have to drive 100 miles, to be successful. God gave me that first rabbit. It was with my very first red tail. The very first time I flew it free, I caught a rabbit. I thought, man, this is going to be a cakewalk, but that was it. From there on, I always say rabbits for me are like Bigfoot. People say they've seen them, and I've seen the tracks, but you get a bird, people call you up and they go, hey, you ought to come out to my house. I got lots of rabbits. I found out that the translation of that is one night I was coming down the road to my driveway and a rabbit ran across the road. And that equates to I got lots of rabbits.
Heard a lot of that too.
Yeah. So I got to where I didn't pay any attention to that stuff. But of course, as soon as I got to be general, there was only about 12 people in the club, the THA, which is a great club, formed up in my second year as apprentice. So that would have been in 1980. They formed up. My sponsor and another man were the driving forces, to put this club together. And my former sponsor, I still consider him to be my sponsor. I have a high degree of respect for him. He was a great broad winger, and he's been a long winger for a long time. He's one of the best. Anything he does, But anyway, they came down here one weekend to show me how to find rabbits. Well, I didn't have any children then. My wife worked in the daytime and I worked at night in a machinist shop. And so I had every day. I'd wanted to be a falconer since I was 10 years old. You think I wasn't out there looking? But they came out here to show me how to find them. They're driving around Tyler. They stayed for the weekend and they didn't even find a turd, So at the end of that lesson, they admitted, I got a problem here.
Yeah.
So of course, as a falconer in Texas, which back in them days, we had Harris hawks and nobody else had them. We had that market exclusively cornered. And when you went to a THA meet of any sort, a mini meet or whatever, the 90% of the birds there were Harrises, because we could just all throw them all up at one time, and just start beating for rabbits. And so, naturally, the red tail at that point in time was still essentially an experimental bird. I mean, people had been flying them for a number of years, but people didn't really know that much about them. In fact, the book that made me realize that falconry was possible. When I was a little kid, you could go to the back of outdoor magazines. Like my grandfather was a lifetime subscriber to Fur Fishing Game. You could go to the back of the magazines and you could order them through the mail. Hawks, eagles, owls. You could buy them and have them sent to your house, But then, I went in the Navy when I was 17 years old. A lot of things happened in that interim. The peregrines and all the endangered species laws and all that kind of stuff got passed. And so I felt like the window for me to ever think about being a falconer had passed. But then, when I was a little boy, I grew up in a very abusive environment. And so reading was my escape. I loved to read. I could go anywhere I wanted to in the world and do anything I wanted to do by just reading a book and just getting totally engrossed in it. So my mother would drop me off at the public library on Saturdays because it was a free babysitter. She'd give me $1. I could walk across the street from the library and there was a little hamburger joint over there. And for less than $1, you could get a hamburger, fries, and a drink. And, the kid's in there. He's surrounded by books. He might even learn something, So, I never did like fiction. I wasn't a guy that liked to read Huckleberry Finn or, that kind of stuff. Cause I'd be reading it and I would be thinking, none of this ever happened. This is somebody's made up daydream and I'm wasting my time. I've got a good imagination of my own, so I liked books about real things. I'd rather sit down with a manual of something and read that than I would sit down and read about something that never happened, So I got interested in a lot of things, and falconry was one of those things. I stumbled across a book by Mitchell. Excellent book. It's called The Art and Practice of Hawking by Mitchell. That was the first thing I ever read about falconry. It just made me burn. I just gobbled it. And, there were other things that I was interested in: hang gliding, skydiving, scuba diving, ultralight airplanes, and falconry. Those are all things that I wanted to do in my life. And eventually, ultimately, after I got out of the military, I did all those things, and found out that, the last thing I did was falconry because, I was working down near the Gulf Coast. Went to a pawn shop one day and they had a whole scuba set in the pawn shop. I bought it all. Then I found out I don't like being cold and wet. And then on top of that, you got like 25 or 30 minutes worth of air and you got to quit and go somewhere and get the tank charged. Plus the waters around Texas are just none of the ones that I've ever been in. You could see past the end of your arm. It's all muddy and murky. Okay, scratch that off the list. That's a rich man's thing. You got to be able to load up and go to the Bahamas, to get any, traction on that. Hang gliding. I found a kid that was in trouble with the IRS. He needed $400. So I said, I'll bail you out, but you're going to have to teach me how to fly that thing. So I tried that. And really, that was really awesome. But had a wreck the second time out. It didn't hurt the kite, and it was just bruises and scrapes on me. Got the wind caught the right tip of my hang glider before I could actually get far enough away from the ground that the left wing wouldn't catch. And so, again, we have no place around here where you could do that. And I'm the kind of guy, when I get into something, I'm in both feet. And all the way up to my ears. I'm totally in it. Well, you got to drive 4 hours to get to the nearest place. That'd be up in Buffalo Mountain in Oklahoma. I'm not a weekend guy. I'm an all-the-time guy. So, scratch that off the list. I was on vacation in Tennessee, Chattanooga, Raccoon Mountain. There was a guy up there. He had an adventure park. He was a former commercial airline pilot from New Orleans, so he's Cajun. And he had a ultralight airplane up there, 2 lawn chairs with a motor on it, cloth wings, and for $25 he'd take you up, Me and the wife had a big blowout over that because she can't stand in a chair and change a light bulb. So that night I told her, I said, look, you can't impose your fears on me. That's not fair. That's not right. She goes, well, you just go ahead. And I said, okay, good. So next day we went back over there and I gave the guy $25 and he took me up. It was an adventure. It was a thrill, no doubt. But that motor was so loud you couldn't hear yourself scream. And then we got up there a couple thousand feet and he killed it. And we were just gliding, his vultures sailing by, it was really cool. And then he went to try to restart it and he was having a little problem getting it started. Well, that kind of made me realize, that these things, they don't have a real good glide ratio, so you get any mechanical problems, it's going to be a controlled crash that you got a 50-50 shot of surviving,
Yeah.
So I thought, well, do I really want to do that? So scratch that one off the list. And then one day we were back and we were over. I sponsored a guy, an apprentice that was I've had 2 deaf apprentices, no talkie, can't hear. But it just so happened that I spoke sign language at the time. And the first guy, it was 2 brothers. They were both deaf, born deaf. And the first guy was also one of the nation's top skydivers. Anytime there's going to be a record attempt to hook up a number of people falling through the sky, he was going to be invited. He was just a phenomenon in the skydiving world. Well, his brother, he had a third brother that could speak and hear. So he calls me up and says, I got a brother that's really interested in falconry and is looking for a sponsor. And I said, well, why don't your brother call me? If he's so interested, why are you calling? He goes, well, there's a little problem. He's deaf. I said, well, that ain't no problem. I speak sign language, So anyway, I got together with him and I kind of suspected from the very beginning that this guy's passion is kissing death on the mouth and living to tell about it. He's an adrenaline junkie, And I just wondered if, falconry is kind of a marvelous mixture of adrenaline and intellectual, excitement. It's a thinking thing. It's physical, sure, and it's a thing where little victories, are huge. And you just get so excited because, you're really going against the pricks, in falconry. It ain't easy because if it was, everybody'd be doing it, and it's something that you really have to be committed to and work hard at, and spend a lot of time with to be successful at it. You got to find where you fit. If you're a round peg, you got to find that round hole where you can fit in and you can be a successful falconer. And so I made him promise me that if he was also into hang gliding, I made him promise me that if falconry began to take a back seat to those other two passions, that he would just let the bird go, let his license run. And he did, ultimately. But one day, he just showed up at my house unexpectedly and had his brother with him, the other deaf guy, Matthew. And, I didn't know they were coming, so I had things going on. I had a buddy of mine he's one of them crazy people that likes the accipiters. He's one of them people that problem solving is what draws him into falconry. He likes solving problems, and you got to be that kind of guy to fly those crazy things. So he had trapped an accipiter and then went off on a honeymoon or something. I don't remember what it was, but he left that bird with me. It was a Sharpie. And he was going to be gone about a week, and he wanted me to work with the bird while he was gone, so he wouldn't lose time. So I still had that bird to go out there and deal with. So I told him, I said, look, I didn't know you were coming. I got a lot of things to do. You're going to have to follow me around. So we went out to my building where I had the Sharpie, and I lit a candle. So it was a very dim light. And them two guys, the brother was knelt down in front, and the guy that it was actually my apprentice was standing over him. And they were both watching me, and how slow, you got to have a good attention span, because I was trying to get this Sharpie to take some food off the glove. And so at some point I wiggled my thumb that was under his feet, and he kind of looked down because of the movement, and he started kind of going down. Then he popped back up, and I rolled my eyes over there to the two guys, and the guy that was my apprentice was looking at his watch, and the guy that was his brother was intensely interested, and he rolled his eyes to mine and he nodded his head like, yeah. I looked at them like, did you catch that? Mm-hmm. And the brother is the one that noticed it, Well, after a while they left, and I told my wife, I said, Matthew's the falconer, not David. It's Matthew. And of course he wound up, I sponsored him. You know how difficult it is for a deaf person to keep up with a bird in the woods? I mean, that's a challenge.
Sure.
One day I pulled into one of my spots. I was flying a Harris's at that time. And I noticed that when I got out of the truck and went back there and dropped the tailgate, that usually she would be fidgeting around in there, and I could hear her bell, but it was quiet. And I opened up the door, and the bell was laying in the bottom of the box. I started to call it off, and then I thought, well, Matthew does this all the time, So I got her out, and I put her up, and I literally, for 2 hours, I hunted walking backwards, because I couldn't. I was just very uncomfortable. It's quite a challenge, but Matthew told me that when a hawk moves through the forest, it has like a wake. It creates a wake. Things respond to it, and he, not being able to hear, and, he picks up on that. So that guy, in all the years he was in falconry, he's no longer in now, he's in Philippines. But in all the years that he did practice falconry, he left one bird out overnight and then got it back the next day. That's it. I was a nervous wreck at the end of that one day. So, but anyway, David, he worked at the local small airport, just kind of keep his habit fed. There was a skydiving school out there where, for $120, you could get yourself clipped to some master skydiver, go up 2 miles and jump out of an airplane. So, that was one of the only things left on the list, so I went out there and I did it. And it was pretty exciting, but it wasn't the terrifying thing that I had hoped it would be. We climbed out of the airplane onto the wing of the plane, which was the most exciting part of the whole deal. Was flying, hanging on to the wing of an airplane, 2 miles up. That was pretty exciting. But then we went 1, 2, 3, and we pushed off, and we were falling. Of course, you're just absolutely insanely thrashing at the air at first, but then the ground school kicked in, go into the spread eagle. And you know how when you're dreaming, you get that tickle feeling in your stomach when you're falling in a dream? Mm-hmm. That wasn't there. It didn't happen. And that's what I was after, that tickle feeling, to be able to produce that anytime I wanted. Mm-hmm. So, the ground didn't look like it was getting any closer because you're so high up, It just was kind of a letdown. And then, 40 seconds of free fall, and then the chute opens, and it's like being in a car wreck. You go from 100 miles an hour to 0, like instantly, pops every bone in your body. And then you glide down and you land. I'm not poo-pooing it. But when you stop and think about this, you got to have $3,000 to $5,000 worth of jump equipment. You're not allowed legally to even pack your own chute. You got to pay somebody to pack your parachute. Then you got to hire a pilot and a plane. Obviously, this is a rich man's sport. I'm not a rich man. Well, a few months later, I scratched that off the list. The only thing left on the list was falconry. And, I just assumed it was illegal, which it is really, but with special permits, you could still do it. So I go into a bookstore, which happens to be my favorite kind of store since books were so important to me as a kid. So on the new arrivals rack, just as I walked into this B. Dalton bookseller store, there was a book called Falconry Today by Jack Sampson. Crappy book. Don't waste your money. But because he made a statement in there that really, it didn't turn me off then, but it really turned me off years down the road. But Falconry Today? So I snatched it up to see when the copyright was, and it was that same year. So I thought, I was amazed, maybe you can do this, but the appendix in the back where it told you how to contact the state game department and get the packet so you could figure out how to get legally practice falconry was worth the price of the book. The thing that later really pissed me off about that book was that when he's talking about red tails, he described them as basically a fat, slow, lazy bird, not really suitable for falconry, but one that an apprentice could fly. Okay. Yeah. Well, at the time I read it the first time, I didn't know that was a huge, ignorant lie. But anyway, so I snatched up that book and sent to the state. Now, bear in mind that in this particular time, there were no computers and no cell phones. To call the next city over from you was a long distance. Yeah. Very expensive. So, and, they didn't have fax machines and all this technology that we have these days, so it took a while for me to get my packet. There was about 24 licensed falconers mentioned with their addresses and phone numbers, and I started calling around, and half of them were either not practicing or weren't practicing at that time, and didn't want to, couldn't sponsor me. And then another visitation of God is when I called Don Raber, who wound up being my sponsor. When somebody's looking to get into falconry and they get this list of falconers and they know they got to have somebody sign the papers, you just typically assume that if they've got a general or a master permit, they must know what they're doing. I mean, they got to be good. Any of them, because, you got to be a general or a master to sponsor somebody, right? But the person that's looking for a sponsor, he's just looking for a sponsor. He figures that the whole pool of people are all capable, so they don't know. But, back in the early days of falconry, most people who were active falconers were real serious. The people that I came to know, they were all serious people, about falconry. Everybody's very passionate, no hobbyists. But then as falconry grew, you had some people that would get their general permit and they couldn't wait to sponsor somebody because that was maybe the only way they could be elevated, because maybe they weren't that great, but if you got somebody that's answering to you, you can feel like you're somebody. And a lot of people got in that maybe shouldn't have, and those people, because in the earliest days in this state, when somebody approached you about falconry, you vetted them, you checked them out, you drilled them, you wanted to know everything about their life, because falconry was so important to us that we didn't want to be the guy that brought in a deadbeat, Yeah. So it was taken very seriously. You had to go to meet the guy that was a prospective sponsor, and he's going to give you the third degree. He wants to know, what do you do for a living? How long have you done it? Are you married? How long have you been married? How many kids you got? How old are your kids? Because, you got to find out if they got the time. That's the first question. A lot of people who think they're interested in falconry, they go, well, how much time does it take? That's a red flag. And my answer to that is not time you have to spend as much as it's time you want to spend, So that's always a red flag. It doesn't mean that they're not a good prospect, but it perks my ears up. I want to know more about this person, because I don't want to bring somebody into falconry that's going to malign it.
So at what point did you actually get to start practicing falconry yourself? And I'm just trying to figure out the time, because you said like they took you sky, you said they took you skydiving and stuff or whatever. But like we kind of jumped there for a minute. It made it kind of sound like you're already practicing at one point whenever you were,
I was practicing at the time I jumped out of an airplane with David.
I gotcha. Okay.
Because that's how I met him. But he got into falconry, and the first year he did real good, but the second year he struggled because of all his skydiving and hang gliding escapades began to put him in a strain.
Gotcha.
To fly the bird like he's supposed to fly the bird. Yeah. And he did exactly what he promised me he would do. He let the bird go and let his license lapse. But
you had already done a lot of those other things though, and ruled those things out by the time you did
so
that.
Let's back up
to
the bookstore.
Right. Yeah.
All right, so I bought the book and I took it home. I was so excited, to find out that, that you can do this legally, but you just got to jump through a lot of hoops, At that particular time, I was also, I got out of the military in 1974. I came home, sowed all my wild oats, and about 75 or 76, I met the woman of my dreams, and I gave up everything to marry her, And so a couple of years later, we owned a mobile home and 7 acres out in the country. And that's when I discovered, that falconry was something that I could still do. Mm-hmm. Couldn't order them out of the back of a magazine, but there was a pathway to practice this. That was the thing that I had so wanted to do since I was a little kid. Of course, I can't even get you to water the dogs, and you want another animal, that kind of thing, Mm-hmm. And then I jumped from the pan into the fire when at 17 years old I joined the Navy, and I was all over the world and back for that duration of time. And then I got out and, of course, you come out from the, Vietnam was going on at the time. And so being in the military was pretty exciting, and whether I mean that in a good way or a bad way is beside the point. But you live a life like that, and then you come back into the civilian world where, you don't have a guaranteed 3 hots in a cot. You got to get out and do some deadbeat job so that you can buy a crappy place to live. And, it's different. So I had a little adjustment problem there for about a year. But during that, I met this girl. And she had this thing since she was a little girl about owls. When her birthday or Christmas came around, you didn't have to think about you'd find something that was owl related, when you went into her house, her apartment to go to the bathroom, you flipped up the owl's beak to get the lights on, and then you lifted up the pot cover, that was an embroidered owl on the toilet. Everything was owl. In fact, it got to the point where she told everybody, okay, that's enough. No more owls. But see, I was trying to impress her. So I went to the local trade day, supposed to be the largest flea market on the planet. And there was a guy there that, he had a owl that he had caught on a pole trap that had a broken leg, that was coming in and killing his chickens. And he said he'd sell it to me for $20. Well, this was very questionable, but I went up there to get the owl, and I bought this owl to impress her. Here's a live one, So I was out having to hunt for this bird every day and to bring it natural food, because I wasn't making enough money to buy food. I'd have to go out with a pellet rifle every day and kill something for this deadgum owl to eat. Well, eventually, and I wrapped the leg, set the leg, and I wrapped it. Eventually, the bird was using it, so basically I rehabbed it, and we carried it down into the river bottom and released it one day, when she wasn't having the owl in her house, So, but anyway, so I finally got that permit, I can be a falconer. Of course, having a permit is not make you a falconer, and having a bird fly across to you and land on your glove is not being a falconer. You got to be taking game with some kind of consistency in order to call yourself a falconer. It's got to be a consistent thing, So, you get into falconer, you still got mountains to climb, Having this permit, now you got to get a bird, which ain't so easy, really, in this area. This ain't a flyway. So they come through here usually around Thanksgiving, around in that November is when the birds start filtering down through here. And otherwise, it's a needle in a haystack to find the right species, the right sex, and the right age is a huge order around here. It's doable, of course, but it's not easy. Mm-hmm. Then you get a bird, and back then, like I said, phone calls from Tyler to Dallas were very expensive, and my sponsor lived in Dallas. And so every time he picked up the phone, the meter started running, you know what I mean? So, and I called him every day, usually around supper time. That's probably his wife probably still hates me to this day, because I'd call up there every day around dinner time and talk to him for an hour, so we got to the point I'd had this bird 6 weeks. I was terrified to drop that crayons to see everything just fly away, Mm-hmm. And he used a little tough love. He said, Gary, he said, it's time to fly that bird free. Don't call me back until you've done it. And I said, yes, sir. So, he said, take your crayons, birds, go out to where you're going to fly the bird, set it all up, call it the thrown the crayons a couple of times, and if it's very responsive, drop the crayons. I said, okay. So I did that. And, got out. Bert came to me instantly, a couple of times. I thought, okay, well, it's looking good. So I unclipped her, got her on the glove, and I started walking around. And the bird left my fist, went up into a tree, and then flew over about 50 yards or so and just disappeared into a little oasis of bushes and trees. When I caught up with her, she was on a dead, rotting deer carcass. So I ripped her off of that and walked what I thought was a good distance away and put her back up. She went straight back to the deer carcass. So went and got her again. This time I hooded her up and I walked a long ways. Put her back up. Okay, we're back on track. Now, every time that I threw her off and called her and she came back, I thought, okay, I did what he said. Now I can call him, Let's call it a day. Let's quit while you're ahead, But then I thought, well, she did come. She came quickly. So I'm going to push this a little farther. So at some point, out from us about 100 yards, there was this little scraggly trees out there all by itself. And I thought, I'm going to start walking towards that tree and see how far that I can get from her before she tries to catch up with me, until she moves up. So the topography of the land right there was like a giant cultivator, hills and valleys. Literally, it looked like, the Green Giant had, tilled that place up. So I'm on top of one of the high parts, and I'm walking, and it's about knee deep in, briars, dewberries and blackberry stuff. And this rabbit, I almost stepped on it. I may have stepped on it. I don't know. All I know is it scared the crap out of me. I mean, it just exploded right in my feet. And it ran down into the low part, and then it turned back. The bird was sitting behind me about 50 yards in a mimosa tree on a low limb. And those mimosa trees, they're not big trees, And the rabbit was running straight at her because it came back up on the high part. And she saw it, and then big old wings come whoosh, and like a diving board, she sprung off of that mimosa tree. And then the rabbit realized, oh, crap, and it did a 180. Now it's running straight at me, and she's flying. And just before it got to me, and the bird was closing the gap, she was catching up with the rabbit. So the rabbit went around me down into the low part. And then, of course, they both went right past me. I mean, I was right there. And then the rabbit took a right and was going to go up over the high part that I was standing on out in front of me about 20 feet. And the red tail, she just turned up and shot up in the sky and winged over and bam, nailed his ass. And so now I don't know really what to do. I mean, because, everything I'd read in the old writings was, like making in, was like, could be getting down on your belly and scooting in on her, because you don't want to spook her. And, none of that's necessary. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And, but I got on my belly in the briars. And I scooted up to her, and I'm looking at those jesses thinking I got to get one of those anyway. I got to get one of those, and I got to get her tethered, so that she doesn't pick this thing up and fly away. But anyway, man, once I realized that, we got away with this, we pulled it off. I thought, man, this is going to be a cakewalk. And, because I thought, my first time to fly my first bird free, we kill a rabbit, man. We're going to set the world on fire. So, at any rate, that's probably one of the most exhilarating feelings that I still feel it when I think back on that day, and that we killed our first head of game. I was hooked. I was hooked before, but now for sure, I'm totally insane.
So as far as then your continued progression with things, I mean, how long was it after that then that you said you realized that you're going to have to start hunting squirrels and then so what was the progression like, while you were trying to figure out, how to go about doing that, when you were going to need to do that. And then from there, what was the inspiration for you to write a book about it, basically?
Okay. Well, I did my apprenticeship. Very limited experience on my own home turf. Very limited success. So, of course, I got my general license, and I'm loading the truck. I'm going down to the deserts of South Texas and get me not only one Harris hawk, but I'm going to bring back two of them, So I brought back two females, Toe and Geronimo. And, of course, there were some things that happened down there that I don't have time to tell you about, but it was pretty weird. But anyway, so I bring these birds back. I'm planning on flying them in a cast, which I ultimately did. But I'm going to train them and enter them individually. Okay, so so there was a rose field. Tyler, Texas is supposedly the rose capital of the world, and I had seen these old black men working out in this rose field one time, and I come in there and I asked them, "You ever see any rabbits in here?" "Oh, yes, sir." I said, "Well, would you mind if I told them what I was doing?" And of course they thought the bird was cool, but they were reacted to it like it was a snake, But they told me I could come in there and hunt anytime I wanted. Well, everything in East Texas is surrounded by woods. I mean, you have to carve out, when you fly over East Texas, it's obvious that you have to carve out a spot to build a house, and then you have to continuously fight the forest back because it wants to retake the land. This is the south. This is the back porch of the southeastern woodlands. It's the same from right here all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's the same woods. So anyway, this rose field was carved out, and I took this Harris hawk, one of the best Harris hawk I ever had. It was the first one, I took her over there, and I was going to try to get out in that rose field, see if I couldn't flush a rabbit. Because, see, the rose growers, they hate them because they eat the bark around the bottom and kill them. So she started moving. She was up on the tree line. On the right of her was the woods, and on the left of her was the rose garden. So she started moving further down to the point to where her back was to me. And I thought, crap. So I called her. She looked over her shoulder and then looked back in front of her and moved again. I thought, uh-oh, I'm losing her. I thought I must have misread the weight this morning, or something's off. She's running. So I got the lure out, and I'm hurdling rosebush rows, swinging this lure, trying to get this bird's attention, and she just glanced over her shoulder and go further in. She took off into the woods. So when I finally caught up with her, I was terrified. When I finally caught up with her, I saw what was going on. She was chasing not just a squirrel, but a fox squirrel. Now, our fox squirrels around here, they average about 2 to 2.5 pounds. But there's a number of them out there that get up to 3 pounds. She weighed 2 pounds. Okay. And plus all that I had seen and been told about the horrors of your bird tangling with a squirrel, I was still trying to get her down. I was swinging that lure and blowing the call. But meanwhile, I was watching this chase, and it was going from tree to tree. Well, red tails and Harris hawks, I would say probably raptors in general, they learn in threes. Once is an occurrence. Twice is a coincidence. But 3 times is a pattern. The third time that it was going to cross from one tree to another, she was ready. When that squirrel balled up on the end of that limb, she crouched down and was coiled up like a spring. And when it leaped out into space, it was about a 4-foot jump to the next tree. Well, at 2 foot, she nailed it. And then you know how they spin coming down, like I call it copter down, auto gyro, you know. She hit the ground and a hell of a fight broke out. Well, I had been told if your bird ever gets tangled up with a squirrel, don't run in on her because you might distract her and get her hurt. So I squatted right where I was. She's like 10 foot in front of me, and she's involved in a hell of a brawl. I mean, to the extent that he outweighed her a pound. And so sometimes she was on top, and other times he was on top. You know, it was a big buck. And she'd get him on top. She spread her wings out to stabilize herself. And she'd just kind of bend her elbows and squeeze so hard that she would just tremble. And she'd do that for several seconds, and then she'd just collapse on top of him. She just used every ounce of strength she had to squeeze him, and then he would explode again, and it was on. You know, man, it seemed like they fought there for an hour, but it was probably 2 or 3 minutes, you know, but to me it seemed like an eternity until finally she stood up and she started picking at him. Oh, I was horrified. I thought, man, she's got to be missing something. You know, she's got to be hurt. But I made into her and was pulling her wings back and feathers back, checking her out. She's not a scratch. And that's when it hit me. You know, for her, as she squeezed the life out of that squirrel, you know, all of her frustrations, you know, just kind of drained out of her. She became really calm. While at the same time, I was watching what would be my future. You know, that all of my frustrations of 2 years with having to drive 100 miles to kill a rabbit. You know, I could find squirrels any day of the week, anytime. You know, I could find squirrels, you know, and I felt like the Harris hawk, you know, is what introduced me to squirrel hawking. You know, that I got drug into it by this Harris hawk. And I hunted the rest of that year in a cast with the other bird, which was not a great squirrel bird. But she wouldn't even chase them on her own. You had to put the other bird up, and then she'd chase them. You know, it's like, I don't want it, but I don't want you to have it kind of thing. But anyway, so I thought the Harris hawk was the answer to my situation and squirrels, you know. So I called Don that night because even though I was no longer an apprentice, I called him. I wanted his approval, you know. I mean, because, you know, I'm going to be a reflection on him for the rest of my falconry life, you know, because he signed the papers. He allowed this knucklehead in, you know, to the fold. So I wanted his approval. So I called him, told him what had happened, and he kind of got quiet, and he goes, "Is she okay?" I said, "Man, she ain't got a scratch." And I said, Can I be up front with you about something, Don?" He goes, "What's that?" I said the same thing Hal Webster said when he saw his first squirrel kill. I said, "It was the dangest thing I ever saw." It was spectacular. He says, "Well, can you find more squirrels than rabbits?" I said, "Duh. Hell yeah." He goes, "Well then, Gary, I think you should hunt what you can find." The only permission that I needed from anybody in falconry was his. You know, he's the only one I really cared what he thought about me, you know, because I didn't want him to ever regret signing those papers, you know. So, you know, for years I thought that the Harris hawk solved my problem, and she did, actually. But it wasn't until I sponsored a guy, for the first time I sponsored somebody who was going to have to fly a red tail, but then after he'd done his duty, you know, after he had been initiated into falconry, we could load up the trucks and go down and get him a real bird, you know?
Yeah.
A month later, he was kicking our ass with a Tiercel red tail, kicking our ass big time, you know? I mean, he was calling me every day, "Got another one," you know, sending me videos, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And so You know, you don't have to beat me over the head. I realized that the red tail was the best tool for that job, not the Harris hawk. They can do it, but, you know, a female Harris hawk is about the same size and weight as a tiercel red tail, average.
Sure.
But there again, although they are about the same weight, you look at their conformation. They don't have nearly as much meat on the Harris. Doesn't have as much meat on their toes. They're just more frail. When they fly like butterflies, you know, compared to a tiercel redtail, who is a tank. You know, they're built lower and stockier and meatier, and their flight is. It takes more effort for the red tail to fly, but that's because they're carrying all this shock power. You know, that when they hit something, you know you've been hit, you know, and they're extremely strong. I mean, they're just brutes. And on top of that, their feet are meaty enough where they can take a bite. You know, and typically, you know, you always get concerned about any bite. But typically by the time you get home, you can't find it. You know, because squirrels' teeth are, needle sharp. In fact, they look like a needle. You know, if you look at them, you know, your first impression is they look like a beaver's teeth, you know, these two in the top and two in the bottom. And they can do some damage, but not just by going in and out. You know, and they're clean. Their teeth are clean because they gnawing on wood and nuts and all that all day. So they don't even have bad breath, you know. So I went back to the red tail, and it didn't take me long to where I knew I was at home. And, you know, in my first book, I wrote, I had a chapter in there about Harris hawks and squirrel hawking. And since I have changed my opinion about that, I can't tell somebody that, you know, you shouldn't fly a Harris hawk, you know, because now I flew that one bird. I flew her for 4 or 5 years, and she never got a serious bite. But on the other hand, I've known other people, you know, that have had Harris's bitten, and red tails too. Don't get me wrong, but the red tail is most likely going to handle it better. You know, the bite. I know that a female Harris hawk, most people in this country got primarily what I call cat squirrels. They call gray. And a female Harris can handle them like a champ. You know, still the question about the meat on the feet. But they can handle that job and relatively safely. We have fox squirrels here, you know, and they are beasts. I mean, they're just a muscle with claws and teeth. You know, they spend their days pulling themselves up trees with their fingernails, you know, and they can run on the underside of a limb just as easily as they can on top. They can jump out of a tree 60 foot up and hit the ground and never miss a step. I mean, they're beasts, you know, they're tough. So, you know, nowadays I've got it down to what is the best tool for that job. And the best tool for that job, and this is not up for debate, and only a fool would argue about this, and the best tool for that job is a female red tail. Hands down. You know, it's not, there's no debate about it. Secondly, a tiercel red tail. And coming into a third place would be the female Harris. I agree with the Colsons that you should never put a tiercel Harris hawk up against squirrels. And so most of these people, you go to every club's got a couple of guys that are flying a cast of Harrises, and almost always it's a male and a female. And their logic is that I might want to breed them someday, you know. Well, for me, that's not a good excuse to pit a bird that's going to be weighing in at about pound and a half or so, up against a formidable. I mean, rabbits, you catch a rabbit, they'll scream and they'll kick. And I got a buddy whose Harris hog was killed by a jackrabbit last year, but it was a freak thing,
That's a jackrabbit, though.
Yeah. But, with a cottontail, they get to a certain point where they accept their fate and go into shock.
Yeah.
And they just give in to it. Squirrels, not so much.
No.
They fight to the death, to their last breath.
Mm-hmm.
They're fighting to live, and they got tools. You got claws like a cat and teeth like a beaver, and they're going to use every bit of it as much as they can, And, initially I was kind of the redheaded stepchild in Texas, not with my sponsor and my few closest falconry friends, but there were a lot of people that didn't want their kids hanging out with me, because he's hunting squirrels with those birds, and that's unethical and irresponsible. It's putting these birds at an unnecessary risk, But, hey, on my side of the coin, success is a hell of a lot more fun than failure. So, I didn't really care what anybody thought. But about 5 years later, my sponsor, who was again president of the THA, called me up and said, because I had just cut off all contact. I dropped my membership with THA. I dropped membership with NAFA. I was just a maverick, a loner out there doing my thing. I didn't need any criticisms from people. I didn't have to live with that. I could just take it on myself, He called me one night. You still flying? Oh, yeah. Still hunting squirrels? Oh, yeah. Are you doing okay? I said, yeah. I said, great. It's fantastic. Stacking them like cordwood in the bottom of the freezer, The birds eating squirrels all through the molt. I don't have to buy food, He goes, well, I was wondering why we hadn't seen you around. I said, well, I didn't think y'all wanted me around. He goes, what made you think that? One of the previous presidents had called me, and I won't tell you what he said because it wouldn't be family friendly. But he cursed me for what I was doing. And I thought, well, that's the president of the Texas Hawking Association. So, so I disassociated myself. He says, well, I just wanted you to know that he don't speak for all of us. We love you, Gary, and we want you to be around. In fact, the reason I was calling you tonight is that I was going to ask you if you'd be our keynote speaker at the meet this year in Waco. I was stunned. Of course, if anybody else would have asked me, I might would have had second thoughts about it, but it was Don. He asked. Of course, I'd do anything for him, So I agreed. And now, you have to understand how extreme that I was back then. I wore tree spikes on my legs and carried smoke bombs. And if a squirrel went into a hole, I'd just run up that tree like a squirrel. And I'd dump a couple of smoke bombs in there, and either he'd come out or he wouldn't, But eventually I learned there's other squirrels in these woods, because by the time you would get all the way up there, the bird would have lost interest and moved on anyway, But I was extreme. I'd had to invent equipment, protective equipment. I mean, first of all, there wasn't any falconry outfitters back then. You had to do, except for Pete Asborno, Asborno bells, best bells ever made. I'd say I'd put Noble bells right up there with Asborno bells. But back then they were like $8 a pair, and they were awesome bells. So anyway, I went down there and I had all this equipment. I was going to give a serious lecture on squirrel hawking, So I had a small meeting room, had a long table, like a school cafeteria table. And I had the tree spikes, the squirrel chaps that I had invented at the time, and smoke bombs and, all this stuff laid out on the table, all serious like and everything. And of course, I had to develop a way to put down the squirrels, because I cannot stand to watch somebody use an ice pick and you don't want to use any bladed item that has an edge on it because the bird's liable to reach out there and grab it, So here comes a guy with an ice pick and he's digging around, and it's just inhumane to me. I can't stand to watch it. When I can kill them in 20 seconds painlessly by either choking them, depending on where the bird's feet are. I'll either choke them or get my thumb and index finger around their neck and just squeeze. They're already out of breath from the chase and the fight. So they're already winded. So, or if the bird's foot's in the way, you can collapse their rib cage, and crush their lungs. If you can feel around, you feel that little heart in there beating, you can squish it and they'll kick out, But it takes about 15 to 20 seconds and they're done. And it's humane, So, I'm getting out there and I'm talking about tree spikes and smoke bombs and how to kill a squirrel with your bare hands. And these guys start laughing. There was probably 25 to 28 people in the room. The club was still pretty small then. And they started laughing. Now sitting on the front row were a couple of guys that I thought would probably be my biggest critics. And I began the speech by saying, the definition of falconry is the taking of wild game with a trained raptor. Amen. Everybody's with me. And I said, the secret to successful falconry is to find out what catchable game you have the most of and then choose the right bird for that job. And those guys that I thought were going to be my critics, one of them was a veterinarian, okay. Amen. I had them, so that alleviated a lot of my fear. But then when I got into the lecture, they started laughing. Because some of them were laughing so hard, they were having tears coming down their cheeks. They were laughing so hard because, I'm an East Texas hillbilly. I got a little bit of an accent and I'm very animated. And then all this weird stuff that is so different from any other kind of falconry, I had one long winger come down and go out with me one time. This was after that. Jay Leamer. A long winger up in the McKinney. He come out and spent a weekend with us, and that after it was all over, I said, what do you think, Jay? He said, man, it's like hawking on bars. Because it was so different. There are similarities. Some aspects of squirrel hawking can resemble like the stoop when a squirrel bails out and running on the ground. Like a rabbit chase or the stoops that are made onto the squirrels by the birds, similar to a stoop on a duck, but then that's the end of the similarities. After that, it's completely different. In fact, I call it the crack cocaine of falconry, because if you ever experience it, you could get hooked on just one experience, So if you don't approve of it, stay away from it, But, at any rate, my wife was one of the very few meets she ever went with me, but she was standing at the back of the room, and at first I thought, okay, is that what this is about? To get me up here and humiliate me, to laugh at me, And then I looked at the back of the room, and my wife was laughing just as hard as everybody else. She was laughing. Then I realized this is so bizarre, to these folks that have been bathed and baptized in so-called traditional falconry, that this was all just unbelievably different, and of course with my personality, so then I decided I'm just going to run with it. They're having a good time. I'm going to run with it. So I did. And everybody had a great time. And then a few years later, this is after I'm back in the fold, A few years later, we had our meet at Abilene. Sunday afternoon, I was loading up to go home. And the vice president of the club at that time was Steve Olson, a very accomplished long winger. In fact, he had an apprentice, Manny Carrasco. I think you've interviewed or spoken with Manny. And he's an artist extraordinaire. But he, Steve, when he signed his papers, he gave him my phone number and said, "This is the guy you need to talk to," because I hadn't flown a red tail in 30 years. This guy is into them, So Manny was wound up being one of my what I call foster apprentices, and made a hell of a squirrel hawker. I mean, he was a good learner. He listened to every word I said and did everything I advised him to do and became a phenomenal falconer. But anyway, so I'm loading the truck, gonna make that 6-hour drive back to my house in East Texas after a meet. And Steve come running out. He's a guy I thought would be one of my big critics, but he's very supportive. So it just blew my mind. So he runs out there and he says, "Hey, Brewer, before you leave, let me ask you something." I said, "What?" He said, we're sponsoring our first NAFA meet next year in Amarillo. And I said, "Yes, sir." He goes, "I was just wondering if you'd give that same speech that you gave in Waco, if you'd give it at NAFA meet." I said, I was stunned, and I said, "But sure." And then I left somewhere between Abilene and East Texas. The thought occurred to me. I'd kind of toyed about writing a book on squirrel hawking since it was just virtually not that common, or at least as far as I knew. I don't think I'm the first guy to ever kill a squirrel with a bird of prey. And I'm reasonably confident that I'm not the first guy that ever did it on purpose, but I do feel confident that I'm the guy that legitimized it. Okay. So anyway, on the way home, it dawned on me, well, if you were ever going to write a book, this would be the opportune time to introduce it. It would be at that Texas meet the following year. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the book. Now, a lot of people don't realize that every word in that book was written on the steering wheel of my car while I was driving.
That was smart.
Yeah. I made me a little rig on a clipboard that I could put my steering wheel tilted all the way up and I'd hook it on there. A lot of highway driving, and I could write without looking down. Every now and then I'd look down and get back on the line, but it was illegible to anybody but me. That night I would transfer it onto a floppy disk.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't remember floppy disks. But I had an old Apple IIe boat anchor, dinosaur, But anyway.
That was back in the day when the floppy disks were about the size of a plate.
Yeah.
The giant ones.
So anyway, I wrote the book. Well, then I got to the point it was written. I didn't have an outline. Just a table of contents, and I just title of the chapter and start writing. I wrote that book one pass. I didn't go back and change anything. What you see was what came out first, I mean, since there wasn't any other books out there on squirrel hawking, nobody could go, well, that ain't right. That's not true. So it was pretty much at that particular time, it was the gospel, according to squirrel hawking. And, I did let my wife read the manuscript, and she thought she knew me before, and I said, you think you know me now, but you read that, you know who I really am, and she did. I mean, her attitude towards me and my crazy passion changed. She still don't get it. But she's very tolerant of it and actually can be my critic. If I'm not practicing falconry up to the level that I'm capable of, she'll let me know about it. You need to practice what you preach, that kind of thing. And, but anyway, so I got the book all written. I had a manuscript, big 4-inch, notebook thing. And I didn't know what to do, how to go about it. So I called Hal Webster. He's the only other book author I knew. I said, well, I've written this book. I got this manuscript. I said, I just wanted to know, what do I need to do where do I need to go with this thing now to get this thing made into a book? And he goes, well, son, the first thing you got to do is get somebody to read it. And I said, well, I was kind of hoping you would do that. And there was silence. And I thought, I stepped over the line, but instead he was stunned. I mean, that's how humble the guy was. He said, well, hey, I'd be happy to read it for you, son. So I UPS'd it to his front porch. It landed on his front porch on a Friday. On a Monday morning, I got to work a little early. I was an insurance adjuster. I'm sitting at my desk and the phone rings. Who the hell's calling at this hour? It's 6 o'clock in the morning. And so I answered it, and it was his printing company that printed his book, Jostens. And they said, Mr. Webster called us early this morning and said, we need to call you and make a deal. So, and he wanted me to print like 5,000 of them, And if you're out there and you're thinking about writing a falconry book, you need to get out of your mind that you're going to make money on this thing, because, you're never going to be on the bestseller list in New York. You'd be lucky if a fraction of the falconry world buys that book. So, it's got to be a labor of love, not money. Mm-hmm. You don't go into it thinking, I'm going to make some money, because that ain't going to happen. Maybe not. Maybe in the long run, if you write a book that is timeless, that people are going to buy, years down the road, you may realize some benefit. But you know what my profit was, is that a couple of years after that book came out, I started being invited by state clubs, wanted me to come speak. And I would always ask them, I don't charge anything for being a keynote speaker, but here's my fee. I want you to fly me in a couple of days early, and I want to go out with some of your people and watch them and, go hawking with them, And so, I've done it. I've been to at least 18 states in the continental United States, and some of them twice and a few of them 3 times. So that has been all the profit I needed, is to be able to go, for people to fly me in and take care of me, and then go out and listen to what I have to say. That 45 minutes on Saturday is just fulfilling my obligation. The real value of me coming up there with those clubs, because most of these clubs are pretty small, was the time I spent with them in the field, one-on-one. Mm-hmm. There was always something that would happen in those 2 days that would alter what I was going to talk about on Saturday night. And as you probably figured out, I don't have a problem talking. Yeah. I'm not afraid of standing up in front of people and talking.
Yeah.
So, so I had the book. Hal read the book, and he thought it was a classic. He told me it'll be right up on the shelf, right next to the classics, boy. He was really impressed with it. Now, I don't know if he was, fluffing my feathers or what, but he seemed to, that really sealed our friendship from there on. He would come to some of those states that I was speaking at to hear me speak, and I would sell his books and he would sell mine. I would tell them, somebody looking at my book, well, if you don't have that one already, then you need to get that one first and then this one, that kind of thing. And so Napa Meat came around. I grabbed a couple of cases of books, because frankly, I thought I'm going to be eating most of these, because squirrel hawking, it's taboo. Now, I gave that speech, and the room was packed. There's 2 or 3 got up and left. The room was packed with these guys in bib overalls and rubber boots, and I didn't realize, and this is true of any falconer who does anything to improve falconry. You know, you do it, you do it to solve your own problem. That's what I did. I never dreamed, not 1 second, that when I solved my problem here that I was faced with, that it would be of any value to anybody else. You know, but it's true that if you solve a big problem of your own, you need to take into account that there might be other people out there that has the same problem, but haven't solved it yet. So you need to sit down and write this down, you know. And so, you know, I had 2 spools of slides for slide projector. That's back when that was the PowerPoint, you know. Mm-hmm. And lots of Harris Hawks chasing squirrels, a lot of action stuff, you know, really, really good slides. And these guys on the front row, man, they were just, jaws were dropped open. They were just taking all this in. These guys were from east of the Mississippi, right? They had the same problem I had, you know, and they decided, falsely, they decided that NAFA, since I was speaking at a NAFA meet, that NAFA had put their stamp of approval on this squirrel hawking thing. I even thought that, but you know, but NAFA didn't know anything about me going to be giving that speech. The Texas Club asked me to do that speech. NAFA had they were blindsided because you have to understand that at that time and for a few years after that, if you killed a squirrel at a NAFA meet, you didn't get a game pen. You got a miscellaneous pen, equivalent to a lizard or a toad frog or a grasshopper.
Okay.
Okay. And so, you know, but the people that were there sitting in the room, they thought it's okay. It's not taboo anymore, you know. And so they went home and started doing it on purpose, you know. And so but a few years later, I was in, I think it was Ohio. And there was a man there who I became friends with, Daryl Perkins. He's a goshawk guy, through and through. He's a goshawk guy. And he's not a squirrel hawking person, but he is a falconer. And he's all in on anything falconry, you know. I mean, and he happened to be there, and he asked me if I could hook him up to go see some squirrel hawking, you know. So we went out and had a whole day. There was several guys there that were serious squirrel hawkers, and we went out, and it was extreme squirrel hawking for the whole day. And Daryl got to see that, you know. He had a blast. And later that night at dinner, I said, "Would you believe, Daryl, that if you kill a squirrel at an NAFA meet, you don't get a game pen, you get a miscellaneous pen, like a toad, frog, lizard, or a grasshopper?" "No, you're kidding." I said, "No, sir, I'm dead serious. Serious as a heart attack." Well, what I didn't realize at the time is that a few years later, he would be the president of North American Falconry Association. He calls me up one year and he goes, "Hey, Brewer, are you going to the NAFA meet in Kearney this year?" And I said, "No, I don't think so, Daryl." And he goes, "Well, why not?" I said, "Well, I ain't lost anything in Kearney. It's too damn cold up there. I'm just too soft, you know, for that." And he goes, "Well, you need to come." And I said, "Well, why?" And he goes, "I ain't going to tell you." He said, "But I'm going to tell you, if you don't come, you'll be sorry." Oh, okay. You know, so I gathered up my handicapped daughter and we went when the time came. Well, of course, me and a buddy of mine from Kentucky was there, and we hunted all the way till dark, you know, and then we had to get back to the hotel and clean up, change clothes, and then get to the banquet. So we were running late. So when I got to the back doors of the room that they were all in, I kind of snuck in the back door, and Daryl was up there giving his State of the Union speech, you know, that they do. And he noticed me coming in, and he grinned at me and finished up what he was talking about. It's as if he was waiting on me to get there before he got to this, you know. But he announced that from that day forward, NAFA would be awarding a game pin for a squirrel kill. And the room went berserk. Whistling, hooping, standing ovation. I mean, it was awesome. And then it would be several years later, you started seeing articles popping up in Hawk Chalk and American Falconry magazine, squirrel hawking stuff. You know, we had come to our port, you know, we were in. And then it was a few years later that NAFA sponsored their first official squirrel hawking meet in Alabama, Camden, Alabama. I spoke at that meet about the history because there's a lot of people at that meet that hadn't been falconers long enough to realize that squirrel hawking has not always had the acceptance that it has now. In fact, the first round of speaking engagements that I made not long after the book was written, you could go to the weathering yard at any meet, count the red tails, and you had a census of how many apprentices were there. And because I was kind of a novelty, you know, if you've been a falconer for a long time, you know that every so often the club has to bring in a keynote speaker that would be relative to the apprentices. You know, because we're sitting out there every year as apprentices and we're hearing about the Aplomado Falcon and the Golden Eagles and, you know, and all that kind of stuff that's just not, it's out of our reach, you know. But then ever so often the board says, you know, we need to bring in somebody that the apprentices could relate to. So I was an author and I was a novelty kind of guy. And so they would bring me in. This is on the first round. They'd bring me in so the apprentices could have, you know, somebody that they could sit on the edge of their chairs and get excited about, you know. But then when I began to make the second round, which a lot of those states I've spoke of twice, you know, you couldn't do that. You couldn't go to the weathering area and count the red tails and know how many apprentices were there. Not even close, because most of the birds in the weathering yard were red tails, you know. The number one bird was a red tail, and the number one game was squirrels going the second time. And, you know, sometimes I have to pinch myself, you know, because I'm nobody. I'm just this guy out in deep East Texas that had a problem, wanted to be a falconer really bad, more than anything, you know, and solved my problem, not necessarily to the satisfaction of a lot of the community of falconry, not, you know, but I became successful, at least in my own eyes. You know, I was having a ball. You know, the chases were amazing. I mean, I think you've hunted squirrels, and you know that, you know, a rabbit chase, and I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this.
It's nothing that I haven't already probably said myself, so okay. I know what you're getting ready to say.
Well, it's a drag race.
Yeah.
You know, first one screw up wins, or loses, rather.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty direct. In a few seconds, it's all over.
And then you don't usually get to see it half the time either.
Right.
Yeah.
And but with squirrel hawking, the chases can be short sometimes, but typically with a good bird and good squirrel woods, you're going to get chases that can last up to a half hour to an hour.
Yeah.
I had one time with that cast of Harris's I flew. That thing lasted 2 hours, and it was really, really cold. We actually built a fire, you know, and took turns over there helping the birds out, you know. But anyway, and we didn't ever catch that squirrel, which was, you know, since neither one of those birds had anything to prove to anybody, was pretty cool, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and chiropractors love us too, because, all the neck problems that we have from craning.
Squirrel hawker's neck.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
I've even thought about building a jacket that had one of those pads, like you see them football players.
Where, the C collar type deals. Yeah.
So what we typically do is when your neck starts hurting, we just lay down on our backs on the ground and watch it. In fact, Manny Carrasco did a cartoon. And that cartoon was me and him and his brother were laying on our backs on the ground watching this squirrel chase going on. And, of course, my dog was yapping up the tree. And you could see all the stars and pows and bams and all that kind of stuff coming out of the tree. That was a true story. That's actually funny. Really happened,
That's awesome. Well, I know you've already shared like so many really cool stories and experiences and things like that. But before we kind of end up wrapping this up and everything, I do want to get kind of an updated modern opinion from you on one particular subject though. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, I know for me, at least, it's the subject of squirrel chaps. Mm-hmm. And, I know you were kind of you're pretty much the main person that initially, originated the concept and everything, but there's still, I mean, obviously squirrel hawking isn't taboo for the moral majority anymore.
Right.
It's, it's an established
Especially
thing.
East of the Mississippi River, you'll get lynched.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, but there is still, for the most part, a very divided consensus when it comes to like the use of something like squirrel chaps and stuff. Like there's still kind of a divide, it's pretty even split, in preference. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you have any, a difference in opinion?
Absolutely.
Go ahead and share it.
Okay. I wrote an article many years ago during the time when we were still being judged. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it was called Squirrel Hawking, Minimizing the Risk. And, of course, that day when I was with that Harris hawk on my first squirrel kill, and I had already resolved in my mind, this is where I'm going, but I felt like I had an obligation to try to do everything I could to make it safe or safer. Look, I did a study one year on, every year the hawk chalk that comes out in the summer, it's got all the club reports. Johnny flew this and Bobby flew that and this, that, and the other happened. And, they would get a red tail got decapitated on a barbed wire fence, stooping in on a rabbit. Johnny's peregrine was hit by a tractor trailer chasing a duck across the interstate. And just on and on, wings broken, stooping in on things. So, this whole thing about squirrel hawking was based on the risks, And of course, I went back through all my old hawk chalks and everything, and I collected all this data. And of course, in that same thing where you'd had this bloodbath of birds being injured and hurt, tracing traditional quarry, traditional birds chasing traditional quarry, a lot of things. Bad things were happening, because that's the way it is when you're out there doing it. Things can happen. And so in that same article, they would go in and little Johnny's bird got bit by a squirrel. Then they'd spend like 3 or 4 paragraphs, going on and on about the evils of squirrels and, how you shouldn't intentionally expose your bird to this, because this is what could happen. When it turns out that it was a minor flesh wound, that healed up within a few days, so anyway, what I found at the end of that research was that it was no more risky to fly a red tail on squirrels as it was to fly anything on anything. And but I still, I wrote this article called Minimizing the Risk, and it was based on 3 things. Number 1, selection of bird. Choose the right bird for the job. Stack the deck in your favor. with the choice of your bird. And that just, as I said earlier, like an hour ago, I said that the female red tail is, without a doubt, the best tool for that job. Okay? So, selection of bird, number one. Number two, protective equipment. And, over the years, I've designed all kinds of protective equipment for red tails. I even thought about using shark mail, to somehow fashion that into some kind of protection. You can never eliminate any risks, but you can minimize the risks that are out there. Okay, so the first squirrel chaps that I invented, a lot of people call them barrel chaps. I call them traditional chaps because they were the first ones that I designed. I went through them, and then I come up with this idea that's still being sold, not by me. One of my foster apprentices learned how to make them, and he's selling them from. I know he's selling them through Northwoods, and I mean not Northwoods, but Western Sporting, and maybe through Northwoods too. But I call them squirrel boots. And what the difference was is they were the traditional chap, but at the bottom they had a skirt, a leather skirt that covered the top of the foot. And I used them for a number of years and sold them. I made them and sold them through Brad's. Of course, again, you were working in the negative because as much labor as it took to make them, you couldn't charge enough to make any money off of them. You just were providing a service, It's all about squirrel hawking for me. It always has been, and red tails. But, I used those. I even made one. I invented one called the Deceiver. And at the bottom of the chap, instead of a leather skirt, I had fashioned leather toes that were, 3 toes that stuck out so that when the bird had his foot planted in the squirrel, those leather toes were sitting on top of it. And the idea was that they would go for them instead of the bird's real toes. And I used all these for a period of time, field tested them. And what I found in the long run was that initial chap, all things considered, when you consider the weight of those things when the bird is wearing them, does it, fighters, they work out with weights on their wrists and their ankles, so that they can build up those muscles. So your muscles will come up to them. You've seen birds that you put the hood on them for the first time and they droop their head, because they're just not used to that weight being on their head, But all in all, that first design I came up with wound up being my first choice. Because the pros and the cons of all the designs, and now as far as whether to wear them or whether not to wear them, any kind of protective equipment, I'm a staunch believer that, you don't fly the bird naked. That their justification for that is that that there's no encumbering, interference from the things that are on their legs, so they just fly them naked thinking that that's going to give them an advantage. And I disagree with that. I've been doing this a long, long time. And I've seen things happen. I've had more experience than most people of waiting on Murphy's Law. Murphy was a falconer. You knew that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
But seeing things that happen, and the thing you don't want damaged is that leg. The bites on the toes are typically going to be flesh wounds. And if you've got some of those traditional chaps on, there's 2 things that will draw a bite in most cases. One is I put something shiny in the front, and it's been stars and diamonds, studs, what they call spots. But now you can't get the stars with long enough tangs on them to where the bird can't rip them off. But anyway, something shiny. Because bear in mind, when the squirrel's on the ground fighting for his life and the bird's on top of him, they have no way to rationalize that those chaps are not part of him, and so they're gonna bite at that because that's in their face, And I noticed that I would see a lot of bite marks at the end of the season around that shiny spot that I would put in the front, because it would attract their attention. It would be the first thing they noticed because it's like a beacon. And so they'll either bite at that, or what's even more likely to take the bite is back in the back. I make my chaps where they interlock. In other words, you can remove them and put them back on because there's a slot on one side and a head on the other, and they go together. You push the head through the slot, fold them back, put a chest strap through there, and they're on. And I do that because if you ever have to remove for an injury or a snake bite or something of that nature, you don't have to destroy the legging. You can take it off, and you can change them out without trauma to the bird, without having to cast them. I can do it on my arm one-handed. And so I definitely do not recommend flying your birds at squirrels without that protective equipment. It's not 100%. But, if your bird winds up getting a really bad bite on their legs, you got to live with that the rest of your life because you didn't have squirrel chaps on them. You may think you're a hot shot right now because you're flying the birds free, so they'll have the ultimate freedom and all that kind of stuff. But, I don't put those chaps on them birds to limit their freedom. I put them chaps on the birds to protect them against most incidents of possible injury. It's just the right thing to do. And then the third point in the minimizing the risk, number 3, would be modified technique or specialized technique. And what I mean by that primarily is when your bird grabs a squirrel up in the tree and it's coming to earth with it, you need to get your ass over there and meet them at contact if possible. But you need to get in there as soon as you possibly can and get control of that squirrel's head and neutralize the risk. And that's your job. That is very important, because when you start to choke them, they'll gape open their mouth, and by poking them an ice pick in their ear or stabbing them with a knife is not going to cause them to open their jaws. But choking them or collapsing their rib cage, they'll gape open their mouth and let go. And you can train the birds not only to accept this behavior from you, but to actually look for it. I use a two-sided lure where there's a tidbit. I don't put gobs of meat on my lures, never, ever. And once they've learned to take that lure in the air, I never just throw it on the ground ever again. They have to catch it. Red tails. And oh man, they love it. They get that shot of adrenaline out of the deal that they're addicted to, But that lure during initial training, early training, creance training, when you're getting them onto, hot to the lure, they've got that lure, one side's always up, but there's another side with a tidbit as well, okay? But they're not aware of. So you go in there initially you go in there first and you just kind of get a hold of the lure and try to pry it up just to the point where they can see the other tidbit. Okay. And then once they understand that you're going to roll that lure over so they can access the second tidbit, then I start getting more erratic about the process. I start running in there with them and dropping down to my knees and grabbing it, and then rolling it up, a little rough. Or I'll come from behind them and jump over them and spin around and squat down and grab it. You just start getting very erratic about your process, because that's the way it's going to be when she hits the ground with a squirrel. They're going to be popping around like spit on a hot griddle, on the ground. So you don't know which side you're going to have to come in on. You may have to reach in behind them. But I've seen them, man, where a bird would be on the ground with a big fox squirrel just, fighting like crazy. And I've seen them as I was running toward them. I've seen them actually look over their wing. Like, where the hell are you? Get your ass over here. I'm not saying that was going through their head, but it certainly was the body language, that they were needing help. They were struggling. And so those are the three things. And one of those things is number 2 is protective equipment. I'm a believer in it,
Well, thanks for your updated thoughts on that. Like I said, everybody, as I always joke, falconers and their opinions, so to speak, and everything else. But no, like I said, I wanted to at least get, straight from the source, at least what the updated, modified opinion on all that stuff was and everything. But, I think, like I said, we've been hearing a lot of great stories and I think have had a really great summation of your overall life and falconry experiences and everything.
Scratch the surface.
Yeah, and
but I want to say one thing before we terminate this discussion about, that question to chaps or no chaps.
Mm-hmm.
I am a person who, it's at one point early in my falconry life and for several years after that, was judged, I think unfairly, but eventually the majority came around, but, as far as I had a friend, I think he's the guy that started this naked squirrel hawking thing, where he didn't fly anything on their legs. And, I don't judge him for it. But if you ask me, my opinion, that is my opinion, that you should use the protective equipment. He was an accomplished falconer in his own right and capable of making his own decisions. And his birds would have to live with whatever decisions that he made, and it wasn't my place to judge him. It's just, you asked me what my opinion was, and I said I'm very, very passionate about the way I feel about this matter.
Sure,
but I'm not going to judge anybody, for if they prefer to do it differently. I know what that feels like, and I'm not going to do it to somebody else.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But like I said, that's a big part of the reason why I enjoy recording and doing all these talks with people, is so that people can listen to all the varied opinions in the community. It doesn't mean they got to follow every single one of them. And it doesn't mean that necessarily that each person's experience isn't going to particularly differ from the next person. And there's several different right and wrong ways to do something. As the proverbial saying goes, there's definitely more than one ways to skin the cat, so to speak. Doesn't necessarily mean someone's completely right or completely wrong for doing necessarily certain things, so I'm like you. I try my best to, people are going to practice and do what they want to do, but I'm like you, if people ask my opinion, I'll share it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do it or come away from. All you're doing is sharing information. People can form their own opinions from that, But
now there are some things that are not opinion.
Sure.
That like the red-tailed female is the best tool for the job of squirrel hawking. That's not my opinion. That's a fact, And some people think I don't like Harris hawks. That's not true. I flew them for several years, and I have a high respect for them. And if all I was going to be flying was rabbits, I'd probably have one.
Sure.
But they're just not, in my humble opinion, and I think that the reality supports that, is that they're not the best tool. The best tool for that job. She is red-tailed female. She's the best tool. That's not even arguable. That's not an opinion. That's just a fact. And anybody that would argue that is a fool. I can say that because I have had a number of years. Look, if I thought the hair sock was a better tool or even as good of a tool, I'd be flying one. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, other than that, I'd be an idiot. But anyway, just wanted to get that, squeeze that in there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, once again, I think that most of the general consensus would be in agreement anyway. You know what I mean? As far as that goes. And I mean, you're not going to get an argument out of me from what I've seen in my personal observations. I agree. I mean, it's hard to beat a nice size, chunky female red tail for that particular job. I mean, it's almost impossible pretty much to beat, So, I mean, hey, well, once again, certain people like what they like and hey, some people also,
I'm not the boss of them.
Exactly. And, some people just love Harris's more than red tails.
Right.
And if that's what they love and they are capable, may not always necessarily be the best tool for the job, but if you've got to love what you're doing too. Once again, they can do what they want,
My new book is called, and it's going to be out anytime now. We're having some difficulties with all the COVID and the paper supplies and all that, getting this thing out here lately, but things are on track now. But it's titled Red Tail, the Workhorse of Falconry, an Operator's Guide. And the third chapter in the book, it's titled Choices. That's the third chapter in the book. And, probably most people won't read that chapter because it's not got an exciting title like the other chapters in the book. But, it's based on the precept that, the success or failure of your upcoming season is going to be determined by the choices you make today. Right?
Sure.
And there was enough to write about 40 or 50 pages concerning choices that people make, and that there's some things that, you have to make a choice, and the best choice is probably already out there, and you have to override what's known, and to go against what the right thing is, and it's going to show in your practice. People can learn from it. Of course, you don't never know the experience and background of the person who's given the advice. Mm-hmm. Usually you don't. And so, people get on their own, and they're, once they get a fairly decent grasp of the generalities of falconry, then they're in a place where they can start to make decisions and choices that may not be mainstream, and that's how falconry progresses and stays dynamic, 4,000 years and we're still learning stuff, I mean, that's pretty dang amazing.
Well, yeah. And I think the other general consensus most people can come to with this is you're never going to be a master of it by any stretch.
Right.
I mean, you're never going to learn everything you need to learn because it's a constantly, evolving thing. And for as long as it's been around, some of the core fundamental principles aren't arguable, and we still do things a lot of the same ways that people did it thousands of years ago because you shouldn't reinvent the wheel when it comes to certain things.
Right.
But all that being said, every single one of these animals is completely different from the other pretty much, and we're all different, and there's always things you can learn.
Well, since you brought that up, I'm a little embarrassed by the title master.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, I get treated like Elvis when I go speak at one of these clubs that invites me in. And, I'm often described as the father of squirrel hawking or master falconer, Gary, or various other titles. Frankly, it's a little embarrassing to me because if anybody considers himself a master, they're only fooling themselves.
Right.
There's no way anybody can master this.
No.
this thing that we love so much. Otherwise, it'd get boring.
Yeah.
There would be no problems to solve.
Yeah.
But or the guru of red tails, I've been just introduced as that. And I really am a little bit embarrassed by that because I don't see myself in any of those ways.
Yeah.
What I'm saying?
Sure.
I come home from one of those meets and then my wife tells me to take out the garbage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. And that's why I think that, anybody that's worth their salt is going to joke to some degree about, because really, as far as our system goes, it's putting in the time. It's not even necessarily a reflection of skill. It's more so just a reflection of the time that's passed since you've put into, what we do. And, I'll never be able to call myself a master falconer either.
Right. Or an expert.
No, I
don't know any experts about anything.
No.
Falconry or otherwise. I don't know any experts.
It just depends, maybe theoretically, if the only thing you ever did was one particular type of bird of a speed or whatever, like if you only ever flew, say, like an imprint or a particular type of, species, and that's the only one you ever flew or did, then you might maybe be able to say that, you whatever, but
there's a difference between having lots of experience and knowledge. Mm-hmm. That's a time thing.
Sure.
But to be an expert would insinuate, or a master would insinuate that there's nothing new to learn.
Mm-hmm.
That we know it all now.
Sure.
That's the only way you could classify yourself as a master. And that's why, that title somewhat embarrasses me.
No, I agree.
I'm very flattered. Don't get me wrong. I'm very flattered when people treat me like they do when I go to a meet to speak. But I don't want anybody to think that that's the way I view myself.
Sure. No, I get it. But you're not going to, once again, it's another thing you're not going to get any argument out of me from, Good. I don't think we're ever going to, there's not going to be enough time in anybody's lives unless you're immortal, and even then it's like, well, I just don't, there's way too many different things you can learn in this to ever be able to be a complete whatever,
right.
But
and I think everybody should be part of their if they love falconry like many of us do, then it should be their goal to leave it better than they found it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because I have benefited, whether they realize it or not. My family has benefited from my obsession with falconry. It's made me a better husband, a better father, a better employee. It's falconry and the principles that you learn from it, if you're doing it in any way right, is going to bleed over into the other areas of your life. And, and if you're not a good falconer, you don't get good results, and those same principles, will bleed over into your home life, your family life, your professional life, and in a positive way or a negative way, depending on how good of a falconer you are and how committed that you are to it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Also, the divorce rates in our community also speak a certain volume too.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because, I solved the problem of me and my wife bickering about all my passions and obsessions. And, like one night I was at work. I worked at night. And so 7:00 at night was my lunch. And I had a brand new bird out there in the chamber. And so at lunch I called home. And she answered, "Hello." I said, "Hey, honey, how you doing? Have you checked on the bird?" And then she got quiet, and then I heard, I said, "What's the matter?" She was crying, And I said, what's the matter? She goes, don't you care how I am? Don't you want to know what I did today? And I said, well, in the first place, you answered the phone, so I figure you're okay. Secondly, I don't have to ask you if you want to tell me something you did today. But what I don't know is how the bird is. And so I made a decision then that, she said, that's all we ever talk about, is them damn birds. If you had to choose between me and the bird, you'd take the bird. And I said, well, you're probably right, but it's not because I don't love you. It's because I don't think you have the right to give me that ultimatum, And so I decided I wasn't going to talk about it anymore with her. I was going to, I was going to respect that. I understand because I know I talk about it a lot, So 3 days went by and I couldn't think of anything to say, And so I get up one morning, go hawking. She gets up, and I fixed us a what do you call it? Brunch.
Brunch, yeah.
Yeah, sort of a breakfast and sort of a lunch. And so we're sitting there across from each other eating, and she goes, did you fly the bird this morning? I said, yeah. She goes, did you catch anything? I said, not today. Did you have any good flights? I said, I thought you didn't want to talk about this, And she goes, well, I don't want you to shut me out of your life. And I reached over and I put my hand on hers and I said, honey, it is my life. It's my life. That's who you married, And so, soon after that, it dawned on me that I was creating the problem with falconry in that I was trying to be fair. See, with a woman, and I'm going to get a lot of hate mail over this, the only satisfactory compromise or negotiation is when she gets her way. Okay, that's the only satisfactory way to end a negotiation or a compromise. Okay, there's no coming to, and so then being fair or compromising or negotiating is just another word for argue. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so my problem is that one week during the falconry season, she'd go, what are you doing Saturday? I go, well, what do you think I'm doing on Saturday? Well, what? Well, I thought you and me and the kids, I thought we'd go to the zoo. Okay. So you feel like a turd. And so you decide, okay, I'm going to make an exception this Saturday. I'm going to go to the zoo, And so, of course, now she just won a battle and she won it fairly easily, mm-hmm. So if you can choose her one time, then, this could be a regular thing, And we were constantly arguing. And so finally, I just had enough of it, and I put my foot down and I said, look, from October to April, I'm a falconer. Don't plan anything on the weekends, because you know what I'm going to be doing. But from April to October, I'm not a falconer. I'm just a regular guy. We can do whatever you want. You pick. I'll do whatever you want. And I said, that's it, period. It's not up for negotiation. It's not compromisable, period, the end. That's it. And you know what? We quit arguing about it because everybody knew, where it stood. 6 months out of the year, I'm a falconer. I'm going to be doing that. Don't get your feelings hurt, Mm-hmm. And the rest of the year, we'll do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, well,
to me, it can't get no more fair than that.
Everybody figures out their own way.
And if they know you're serious, about it, they'll either leave or they'll get with the program.
Well, therein lies the thing. Yeah. Sometimes there's a vast majority that aren't willing to get with the program, and that's everybody's path. They
didn't really love you as much as they said they did anyway. If that's the case,
There's an argument for that too, for sure. Well, I think that's like I said, that's another interesting topic. And
most falconry husbands are trustworthy because they're too busy out chasing this bird around and doing that to get in trouble.
Right.
You know, I mean, my wife doesn't always know where I'm at or who I'm with, but she knows what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we've been married this past August was 47 years.
There's a lot worse things for someone to be obsessed with or all in on.
Yeah. I told her, I said, my passion could be getting drunk and chasing women.
There you go.
You could have it a lot worse.
There you go.
You know, and the women do tend to, maybe not, they may not even realize it themselves, but they kind of consider that bird as being competition like another woman.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, some of them do. They don't realize it that they're viewing it that way, but they want you to choose between them and the bird a lot of times, and just so they can feel like they're still, you know, on top of the heap there. You know,
right.
But it's not like that. It's, from our perspective, it's not like that. The bird's a whole different thing. You know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't mean also that the same thing can't conversely work, you know, from, hey, you know, if the wife in the relationship is a falconer too, you know, right. I mean, the same, it is what it is. Everybody's got.
Usually she's not.
Yeah. Well, regardless of what the situation is, everybody's got to figure out their own paths and compromise.
I can tell you this much. Falconry is kid friendly and should not be, an excuse to get away from your kids.
Sure.
Kids are fantastic bush beaters and they can't be still.
I wish my kid was more into it, but he's not, you know,
mine
he
were
never
when they
really
were
has
young.
been.
They're not now as adults.
Yeah.
You know,
my kid never was really into it. I think he came, like I said, he came hunting with me, I think 3 different times throughout his childhood. He's 15 now. And every so often he'll ask about it. But for the most part, he could have cared less. He was, you know, the more of the norm in that regard. But it is what it is.
I've got photographs of my son when he was 2 years old. He was my firstborn. When he was 2 years old, he's sitting on my shoulders, got 2 handfuls of my hair. That's how he's staying there. I got a falconry bag on one shoulder and a diaper bag on the other one. And then I've got a stick in one hand and a Harris Hawk on the other, you know, and that's true. I never felt like he was in the way, you know. He grew up, and in fact, he was in middle school before he realized that not everybody's daddy did this, you know, because all the guys that popped into my house were falconers, you know. Mm-hmm. So he thought it was a real common thing.
Yeah.
Till he got in junior high and realized that I was the cool dad.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, hey, like I said, to each their own. Everybody's got their own family paths to work around and stuff when it comes to all this. But no, this has been like I said, this has been a nice, I think, synopsis of your life and history and involvement in all this. And, you know, I mean, there's already been some good advice that you've given, and, you know, whether or not, like I said, you have much more. I mean, I'll give you one opportunity here to go ahead and share one last piece of advice here, and then we can go ahead and wrap this up and call this good, because I don't know about you, but I'm getting hungry.
Me too. Hey, I've enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, no.
But, you know, it's time to eat.
Yeah.
But if I had any advice, it would be to 2 different aspects of people. There are those that are seeking a sponsor and those that are considering an apprentice. I think that choice should be taken a whole lot more serious, you know, because, you know, our sport, you know, is only going to take one jackass, you know, to screw it all up for everybody, you know, so we need to be careful and deliberate in the choices that we make of sponsors. If you're an apprentice or a prospective apprentice looking for someone to sponsor, you know, now we got the internet, we got cell phones. There's no long distance anymore. You know, you need to check out this person that you're considering to learn under, you know, and as a potential sponsor, you need to take into account a lot of things, not just because they want it. I want a lot of things that I shouldn't have, But I just think that we need to take that. I mean, America and Great Britain, you just go buy a permit and then go to the pet store and buy a bird.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have this. I consider the apprenticeship program a great thing for falconry. Because after all, falconry, I mean, you can read all the books you want to read, but really, it's really something that is passed on from one person to another, technically, and ultimately, it's something that is taught by somebody that's been doing it for a good while and been successful at it to somebody who is just now wanting to get in on the ground level. And that person that you're considering to sponsor should fit a certain criteria that you're looking for. I mean, I won't sponsor kids because you're sponsoring their parents. You're going to be dependent upon their parents. And if the guy makes a C in math, are they going to use falconry as a punishment? They say they won't, but, there's a place for that, sponsoring youngsters. But I prefer a middle-aged person who's been married to the same person for a long time, if they're married, been working at the same job for a long time. I want somebody that's stable, who's got a life that demonstrates that they're stable and that they'll stick with something. And then we want to make an agreement that if you get into this and you find that it's a lot harder than your fantasy was, that you'll do the right thing. Don't continue to imprison a bird and not fly it. Let it go and let your license lapse, And the sponsor, the prospective sponsor, he needs to be prepared that if they are not fulfilling the minimum, requirements that you would have, don't let them go to the general level, because those people that are just allowed to go up just on the basis of time, they can't wait to sponsor somebody, because that's the only way that they can be looked up to.
Yeah.
They can elevate themselves by sponsoring somebody. And, falconry reproduces itself. Good falconers will produce good falconers, and crappy falconers will produce crappy falconers.
Yeah.
So that's the very basic level. Is the decision to sponsor or not to sponsor, or to pick this guy to be your sponsor or that guy to be your sponsor. So it's one of the most serious decisions or choices that you will make.
Yeah. No, I agree. And like I said, we have to make sure that, reputable people are coming up and everything else. But
you're going to entrust them with our sport.
For sure.
So they should be criteria to be met. Not just anybody that wants it.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. And speaking of important decisions, I think the important decision now of what we're going to eat needs to be made.
Absolutely.
And
I have an opinion about that too.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do, bud. Well, like I said, I think this has been a great talk, and I've enjoyed it. I'm glad you've enjoyed it. It's I will say you're definitely gonna take the record so far as the longest chat that I've had so far. But hey, it's great stuff. I'm glad that you were willing to share it with the whole world. And let's go ahead and get something to eat, call it good, and we'll talk some more. Hopefully sometime soon, I guess. But
anytime.
Yeah. Well, like I said, thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate you, Gary. Thanks. So that was the first part of this conversation that I had with Gary while I was doing some recordings down in Texas. And I should make mention of the fact, too, that Randy Watson was the one who contacted me about coming down and doing this episode with Gary and some other falconers from down in his area. He's the one that sponsored this particular group of episodes that are coming from his neck of the woods down in Texas. So thank you again, Randy, for having me down and for helping me get all these stories out to the falconry community. It's much appreciated. And the reason there's actually two parts to this episode is because we actually had a cancellation a day or two into recording, and we thought, well, there's actually some other things, believe it or not, that Gary could have went a little bit into further detail on that he actually didn't mention in this first 2.5 hours or so. in regards to some of the roles that he played as far as getting some rules and regs and things like that changed in Texas and some other things. So I figured I would go ahead and just combine these two parts into one large episode here for you all, since, as I stated before, I kind of wanted to start things off with a bang with a new podcast and all that kind of good stuff. So also, that being said, I wanted to make mention as well of one of the usual sponsors of the podcast, being Seth Roy from North Mountain Goshawks, and just wanted to say thanks again to Seth for continuing to support the podcast. And for all of you that are in the market for a new game hawk, I know many of you know we're getting close now to the breeding season, so if anyone wants to get on the list for a great new game hawk, particularly a parent-reared North American finish or Russian goshawk, hit them up. NorthMountainGoshawks.com or North Mountain Goshawks on Facebook, or email at ostringer3@gmail.com if you want to get on that list and have yourself a great new hunting partner for next season. And all that being said, I will go ahead and turn things over to this second part of this conversation with Gary Brewer. And thank you all for listening. Hope you're enjoying, and here we go.
Kick it off.
Well, like I said, thanks for coming back again today, Gary, because I know as we got to talking more, especially when we were having lunch yesterday and talking more kind of in the interim and everything, it became apparent that, there was a lot of stuff that we didn't cover. Even in that 2.5 hours, there were still some really cool stories and things that people, I think, will be interested in hearing. Like, when I started hearing them, I was just like, well, hell, why didn't we get these covered yesterday? And sometimes, this is a situation where who knows what's going to happen in the future? Who knows when I'm going to see you again? Mm-hmm. And, while I'm here, and because we had time again today, it just made sense to go ahead and have you come back and share some of the stories and stuff that we didn't quite get to during that 2.5 hours yesterday. Basically, the way I'm going to treat this is I'm just going to turn things over to you and let you share a couple of the stories that we were kind of reminded of when me, you, and Randy were talking yesterday at lunch and stuff. And yeah, man, just we'll get a few more of these stories, chronicled and saved for the future. And yeah, man, just go ahead and take it away.
Well, of course, 45 years.
Yeah, it's a long time.
To try to cover in a couple, 2 or 3 hours. A lot of things have happened in my falconry life, and it's been really the driving force in my life. Aside from my faith, falconry is right up there. It's something I'm very passionate about. My family understands that. And, when I'm dead and gone, nobody's going to care that I was a good machinist or a good insurance adjuster or any of those things. But what the people closest to me will remember is how much I love those birds and falconry, and it was something that they'll attest to the fact that I talk about not much else. And that no matter what subject that they bring up, I can twist it into something to relate to falconry, and, I don't, I try not to be overbearing about it, because that's what's in my mind a lot of the time. Since I got into falconry, I've not been bored, not one time, because you go to the dentist office and he goes, well, the dentist is running a little bit behind, so it's going to be a while. And I'm like, cool. I go sit down in the waiting room, and it gives me an opportunity to think some problems that I want to solve, or some issues that I want to address, or I'm playing over and over in my head some chase that we recently had, and could I have done anything to make it better, and so I've just always got plenty of things to think about. I've always trying to make it better, at least for me, and occasionally it works out to, if I make something better for me, it makes it better for somebody else too. That's just a side benefit. That's what falconry is all about. I mean, we should never just get complacent and say, well, okay, it is what it is, and we'll just accept that. I mean, first of all, that wouldn't be American. America, like the Chinese invented gunpowder, and we took that and came up with the nuclear bomb. That's just how America is. And that's, the British, are known for falconry, but, the Americans got a hold of it and they just took it to a whole nother level, and it's just our nature as Americans. But, so, a supposedly 4,000-year-old sport. I think it's older than that myself, but, 4,000-year-old sport, it just continues to evolve, to be better and better. And more birds, we're flying birds these days that they didn't fly 4,000 years ago, I'm sure. We're flying birds and chasing game that I doubt has ever been chased, so it's ever changing. And that's one of the things that, you can't ever learn it all, and so you can't ever go, I'm bored, I know everything,
Sure.
It's just not going to happen, because there's always somebody coming up with some kind of idea, that gives it new life. It's like an onion. You keep peeling that onion, there's always another layer. I got to be a general falconer, and I went and trapped those 2 females, brought them back, and I had that one female that took off after a squirrel and wasn't gonna listen to me trying to stop it. And all the while that I was trying to stop it, and I was horrified that something bad was really going to happen, I couldn't help but watch what was going on, and it was just spectacular. And so at that time, I realized, my life was about to change. That I was about to go down a trail that was really not a recommended trail, but that I didn't have any choice, because success is a whole lot better than failure. And but I thought that the Harris hawk, was the answer to my problem. Because she's the one that went after the squirrel the first. But what I hadn't contemplated was the fact that with the first 2 birds that I had flown in my first 2 years in the apprenticeship, I avoided squirrels like the plague. I didn't fly them in places where they would likely encounter one. So I don't know, that first red tail I had might have been a really good squirrel hawk if I'd have just gave her half a chance. But so I started hunting squirrels with the Harris hawk. I thought that was the answer. And somewhere down the road, I got this apprentice. We talked about him in our last session. He's a deaf guy, and he was going to fly a red tail, and we were going to try to see if that red tail if we couldn't coax it, to go after squirrels. And a month later, him and that red tail was just kicking my butt all over the place, me and that Harris. So, I'm always about improving things and making things better. So I saw that the red tail might be a whole lot better choice, in squirrel birds. So I went back to the red tail. Well, a little later, I had another apprentice, and he had a nice big female red tail, and he lived out in the country like I do, and really not too far from me. And he called me up and said he thought he was ready to fly this bird free. So I wanted to be there when he did it. So I wanted to verify that I thought she was ready. So I went over to his house. He lived on some acreage. There was a dry wash that went, that sometimes the creek would overflow and the water would go up into this dry wash. But from the top of the dry wash and all around it, it was all pasture. So, but in the dry wash, there was a lot of trees and underbrush and stuff. So we put the bird up on the edge of that dry wash because it had trees it could fly to from one to the other to see if we could get this bird to follow. Well, she moved about twice, and then she took off down into that dry wash and started chasing this big fox squirrel, and she caught it. Well, I was a lot scrawnier than my apprentice, so I got there first. I got down to the bottom of the wash where she had this fox squirrel pinned, and then he caught up with me. And his name was Todd. And I looked at Todd and I said, Todd, if you ever decide to do anything stupid, like get rid of this bird, I hope my phone will be the first one to ring. Well, later on that year, I took him to a THA meet, and he went out with a group of long-winger guys, and the good ones. We got some good long-wingers in this state. But he went out with them for a day, and he was thoroughly impressed. He had all the earmarks of a long-winger. Of course, he lived in East Texas. But, he drove the real expensive SUV with all the bells and whistles. Every hair was always in place. His hair was never messed up. He wore the sport coats and the turtlenecks, and he just had long winger written all over him. Not that every long winger is that, but if you've been around falconry for a while, there's a difference between the long wingers and the dirt hawkers. So the dirt hawkers are the guys in the bib overalls and the rubber boots, the ball caps, and they come to the banquet dressed like that, typically. But anyway, moving on. When we were on our way back home from the meet, which is a 6-hour drive from Abilene to where we live in East Texas, he expressed to me that he wanted to be a long winger. And I talked to him for a long time about, that's a real difficult order, in East Texas, because the trees grow right up to the water puddles around here, so it's very seldom. There's a few farm tanks out there, but a lot of them you can't see from the road. It's just, it would just be tough to pull that off. And, but it didn't change his mind. And so finally, that little devil on my shoulder says, offer to get him a falcon and swap it for that red tail. So I told him, I said, Todd, if you really want to fly a long wing, I'll get you a long wing and we'll trade even Steven for that red tail. Well, everybody thought I was out of my head. You're going to trade a falcon for a red tail? And I said, damn, it's not just any red tail. I saw a lot of potential in this bird. So I put the word out that I was looking for a falcon. And some guy from Michigan called me, because I had a buddy, Bert Lossberg. He was a breeder, and he had moved up into Oklahoma City. And, I had called him and told him if he knew anybody, and he put the word out. And it turns out that he had sold a bird to a guy in Michigan who had already had a goshawk that he had flown for a number of seasons. He was going through a divorce, and he was going to have to get rid of one of them birds, and it wasn't going to be the goshawk. And the falcon, he'd just gotten it and hadn't done anything with it. So I called the guy, and he agreed that if I would pay all the expenses to get this bird down to Texas, that he'd just give it to me. So, deal, But Todd had not gotten his general permit. He's still going to have to go through, half a year. So we couldn't make the trade then. So now I'm stuck with this falcon. I got to fly it, so I had to throw up a pigeon coop. And since I didn't have a flock of pigeons, that in my backyard, on Friday and Saturday nights, me and another buddy, we'd go climbing all over all these old buildings in these little old towns, and we was catching pigeons with a flashlight and a landing net. And so I'd bring home a big bag full of pigeons, and then through the week, of course, we'd use them. Well, when the bird missed them, they'd just wind up back where we got them. So we just had us a route, like a milk route. We'd go around and catch these pigeons. So finally the day come that he had his general permit and we could make this deal. I got the red tail and he got the falcon. Well, he flew it for a year, didn't accomplish anything with it. He gave it to another guy in East Texas that flew it for a year, didn't accomplish anything with it. who gave it to a guy up in Fort Worth area who flew it for a year and lost it. Meanwhile, that red tail became a legend. I mean, she was an awesome bird, and a lot of the older falconers around here that knew me during that time, they knew and respected that bird. So I ask you, who got the better end of that deal? You know, I mean, it wasn't so foolish is what people thought, because I wound up with a really great bird. And she eventually was released about the time she was 10 years old, released right there onto the same pole that she was trapped off of. So I presume that she went out there and found her a mate and got those genes into the next generation, and that there's some really good red tails out there with her DNA flying around.
Yeah.
So
it's all in the eye of the beholder, you know, what a good deal is and what isn't. But the story that I want to hear next is this. I keep hearing this over and over again, the story about this alligator and, you know, and this whole fiasco that I that I heard you had to deal with this one particular incident. Go ahead and tell that story real quick.
You know, I was flying a Harris Hawk, so this had to have been at least 35 years ago. And, you know, I never knew we had any alligators around here. Apparently there had been alligators here, but they killed them all out. But I guess it was probably around between 35 and 40 years ago. I had taken a Harris Hawk that I had brought back after the best one that I had that got me onto squirrels. I went through about 3 Harrises after that had no interest in squirrels. These are passage birds. And but I had one that went after a duck and caught it. I mean, it wasn't what I was trying to do, but it happened just like that. And so I thought, okay, well, let's see how our luck on ducks will be. So, you know, out there where this all happened, years and years and years ago, when I was a little bitty boy, there was a water treatment plant that was out there. It's called Black Fork Creek in north side of Tyler, Texas. And, of course, at some time in the past, they abandoned it. But, you know, it's the old style water treatment plant where they had all these natural sloughs that they dug. Then they would run all the water out there to let them settle, you know, let the junk in it settle. And when they abandoned that water treatment plant, all the buildings are gone. It's just all that's left is these sloughs. And Black Fork Creek runs through there. And some beavers got in there, and they dammed it up and caused a lot of the water to back up. So all those settling sloughs were all filled with water all the way up to the top, but there'd be like a sandbar between them. You know, and of course, you know, it was a water treatment plant with sewage and all that. So, you know, the plant life there was just tremendously thick. But the ducks would go in there and settle down. So, you know, you couldn't walk on the sandbars because the brush was so thick. So I got me some chest waders. And it was a lot quieter if I could get in the water and walk, then you could sneak, you know. And so I had one of these Harris Hawks with me that day. She was up in the plant growth overlooking me. And I'm going down in the water. I'm going down in this settling slough. And at the end of the settling slough, there was a row of brush. And then on the other side of that, there was a beach, a sand beach where the Black Fork Creek came in there, and there was a bend, and the water was kind of deep there. So the bird took off, and she flew over that row of brush at the end of that slough that I was walking in. And then I heard, I didn't see it. I just heard the duck was making all kinds of racket, and there was wing beating and water splashing. And I knew she had a duck. So as fast as I could go in the water, I got there, and I crushed my way through that brush line onto this beach. And there was about 20 foot of sand between between me and where the bird, the Harris and the duck were fighting. And, they were both covered in mud, and that duck was just beating the crap out of her. So I needed to get there and to help her. And so I took about 2 big strides, and the water behind them boiled. And this massive alligator came up out of the water and landed on top of them sideways with his mouth open and snapped them up, both of them. And I just froze in my tracks. And then after he chopped them a couple of times, he backed into the water, and then he just settled down beneath the surface of the water with nothing but bubbles. And I didn't believe what I just saw. A freaking alligator, and this is a place where when I was a kid, I used to swim in that creek, and so I thought, and I never saw him again. There was just a few feathers floating, on the surface of the water. And so I thought, Austin is not going to believe this. I'm going to file a report that I lost a bird to an alligator, and it got the duck and the bird. So I went and I started filling out the report, the 3186A, about the loss of this bird. And I thought, they're not going to believe this story. So I got my little Instamatic camera, and I went back out there, and I sat above that bend in the creek for hours until that alligator finally showed itself, and I took a picture of it. I still have a picture of that alligator. And I sent that to George Adams, and he was the guy over permits in Austin. And I attached a letter to the 3186A. I said, I didn't figure you would believe this, so I've attached a picture. And he wrote me back, and he said, man, nobody's going to make up a story like that. They make up something that would, sound reasonable. But anyway, I just figured, I wasn't a falconer who was well known or anything at that time. So I just figured this must happen in Louisiana all the time, or South Florida. But I've never heard of anybody else having their bird snapped up by an alligator, and especially here where I live. Now we're finding alligators everywhere. The alligators have just exploded in their populations around here. I'm scared to when I had my dog. It always made me nervous because he liked to hunt the edge of the water, and in Bellwood Lake, and there's alligators in Bellwood Lake. I've seen them. So alligators are starting to be a problem. I can't believe that somebody in Louisiana hasn't had a bird snapped up by an alligator, as many as they got down there.
Oh, I'm sure it's probably happened. We just hadn't heard about it or something.
Surely.
Yeah. First of all, that was a crazy story. Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, obviously in southern Indiana, that's not something we're probably going to run into. If the first thing that we ran into was like an alligator or something like that, the first thing I'd have to ask is, okay, which ass decided to release their pet alligator and that they raised in their bathtub or something in the creek?
I don't know where they came from.
Yeah,
but they're everywhere now.
Yeah, well, I can understand that here, but man, I would, yeah, that would be nuts if we ever saw that.
I was pretty freaked out.
Yeah, I bet. But well, I mean, the next topic then I want to ask you about, and the next thing I want you to talk a little bit about then is, we brushed on quite a bit. We brush on, using dogs and falconry and things like that. And, I talk a little bit more about your thoughts on, the dogs that you used, or, what breed has kind of piqued your interest over the years and things like that. Because we may have brushed on it some the other day, but I don't know.
We talked a little bit about it, but we didn't talk about the dog.
Right.
Of course, with squirrel hawking, a dog is not a necessity; it's a luxury. Mm-hmm. But damn, what a luxury they are! Because when you're hunting the squirrels in the forest, and some of the forests, like the ones you hunt around here, that squirrel, if it hits the ground and it runs, 30 feet, you've lost sight of it. It disappears. And then when you finally get to where you lost sight of it, you're looking around, there's at least 100 places it could be, And so, what the dog does, and I ran into a guy up in, I think it was Indiana. We were at a NAFA meet. The NAFA meet was in Amarillo, but this guy, I think, was from Indiana. So his sponsor wasn't able to make the meet, and he told him to look me up and that to get me to go out with him and give him my thoughts, Well, this guy had some kind of a retriever, like a golden retriever, and this dog was bigger than me. This dog weighed over 100 pounds, and he's out there hunting rabbits with it, and it's the family dog, right? A lot of people want to try to incorporate the family dog into their falconry, and it's just rarely ever a good idea. Okay. First of all, that dog cannot pursue the quarry any further than he could because they're both big. So if you're going to use a dog in falconry for rabbits or squirrels, of course, I'm coming from a squirrel background, but rabbits or squirrels, the dog needs to be sized as close to the size of the quarry as possible. That way, there's not any place they can go that the dog can't go, right? Just they get 100% benefit from the use of the dog. So, I went up to trap with Kenny and Virgo, ridge trap, just for fun. I had a foster apprentice from Mississippi that seemed to be having a problem trapping a female where he lived. So we just planned to make a trip up to Northwest Illinois and ridge trap with Kenny. And we wound up coming back with a nice female with it. But while I was there, a guy that I had met at a Bloomington Normal meet when I was invited to speak at the Great Lakes. He was there and he ran Jack Russell Terriers. I don't know whatever happened to him. I've lost touch with him. But anyway, he took me out to watch his dogs work. And I'd always ran Brittany's just because that was the only breed of dog that my Harris would tolerate. And after I watched his dogs work, we were on our way back to the hotel, and he said, "Well, how would you like to have a dog like that?" And I said, "Well, what do you get him?" I wasn't wanting to put in an order for a dog, but I didn't want to insult the guy either. So I said, "Well, what do you get on him, Lake?" And he goes, "Well, I get $400 for the males and $300 for the females." And I thought I had the perfect answer. I said, "Well, if I had $400 that I could let go of, I'd love to have one." And we left it at that. 2 years passed. I had met Kenny at that meet as well, Kenny and Virgo, old time red tailer. He's since passed on, but he had invited me up to his place to ridge trap. So we went up there. Lake found out that I was going to be in Northwest Illinois, which is just one state over, he says, "Would you mind if I come sit in the blind with you?" And I said, "Sure, that'd be great." So we drove Saturday and Sunday, got up there Sunday night, and Tuesday morning, Lake arrived. And I went out there to meet him in the front yard, and he gets out of his truck and he turns around and he's got in the palm of his hand, he's got this little 6-week-old male Jack Russell puppy, slick coat, black and white. Adorable dog. But, my first impression was I was a little bit put off because I didn't ask for this dog, and so I thought I saw this problem. I told him, I said, "Lake, I don't have $400. And he says, "You got $1, don't you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I got $1. And he goes, "It's bad luck to give away a dog. Give me that $1. And he handed me the dog. So now I'm stuck with it, And I got a whole week trying to keep this dog from crapping or pissing on Miss Virgo's floor, because she's got a whole house full of guys laying everywhere sleeping. And so I kept him in my shirt, where he couldn't get into any trouble. Eventually, as the week progressed, he won me over. And I decided that, I had a 24-hour drive to get home. And somewhere in that 24 hours, I made a mind that, I was going to make this the best damn hawking dog the world had ever seen. I was going to pour everything into it. And I did. And he was a fantastic dog. 16 of the best years of my falconry life were spent with that dog. And he lived to go hawking. I trained him very well. I had trained several dogs prior to that. I'd already learned from a lot of mistakes, things that you want to instill, and, later on it'd be too late to do it, so get it all in early. And I mean, he was anybody that ever knew him was more impressed with him than they were with the birds. He was just an exceptional dog. And he hunted the day before he died. He was 16 years old when he died for a Jack Russell Terrier. That's like 120, because they're usually dead by the time they're 5, chasing cars and stuff. They get into a lot of trouble if they don't have a job. Well, he had a job, and he did it very well. He got hit by a lot of big red tails in his life, but he just took it as all in a day's work. If you want to go, that's a risk you got to take, and I feel for anybody that never got to see him work, because he was a phenomenon. So, I told you all that to say that, a dog, a well-trained dog, and the most important aspect of training a squirrel hawking dog, I mean, you don't have to teach a Jack Russell or a Feist or any of those type of dogs. You don't have to teach them you don't have to teach them to hunt. And that's in their blood. You have to get control of them. And see, that means that as the dog handler, you got to be on your toes all the time. You got to be watching that dog, because if he gets stimulated by something and he breaks, they become deaf. They can't hear you. You have no control. So you have to be watching that dog, and when them ears pop up and that nose wrinkles and he's staring intently in a direction, that's the time to call his name, get his attention, and get control of him, because you don't want him running on autopilot, and, you've got to teach the dog the ring of respect, where they're not permitted to run in on the bird that's on the ground with a kill. It'll get to the point where any given bird will come to trust the dog that knows how to behave. A dog that respects it. They'll accept the dog to the point where the dog could go in there and lick, the quarry that the bird is standing on, and there not be a big problem. But the next bird you take on may not have learned that. And it's almost impossible to untrain the dog to be able to go in there. So you teach that dog the ring of respect from the get-go, and you maintain it forever. The dog is not allowed to run in on the bird on the ground. And you teach them that during the lure training and early training. When the bird is on the ground on the lure, and you allow the dog to approach and stop the dog when the bird burrs up, and then wait until the bird starts to lose interest in the dog, and you let the dog come in a little closer, but never closer than 4 feet away from the bird. So, but the dogs are very valuable, and they're a lot of company. I mean, he was my best hawking friend, I mean, when nobody else felt like going, he wasn't going to be left behind. He loved it. And, the birds get to where they key off the dog. If the dog is well behaved and controllable, they'll learn to read the dog, and the dog learns to read the bird. I mean, the dog will hear bells, and it'll stop and look at the bird. And the dog learns to tell the difference between a bird just moving up and a bird thinks it saw something. They know the difference. And when they see a flight of interest, they rip towards the bird. And when the bird lands, they just start working underneath them, looking for whatever it was. And the birds learn to watch that dog. They can tell when that dog is on hot scent. And when they pick up on that, they'll move over and hunt over the dog. So, and another good thing about it is, of course, he was black and white. He was a little guy, but he was black and white, very visible in the woods. If I didn't know where the bird was, all I had to do was find him, and the bird was going to be somewhere close by over him, So, and sometimes, in squirrel hawking, now this is one of my pet peeves, okay, is that, squirrel hawking is way different from rabbit hawking or any other kind of hawking. If a bird catches a squirrel up in the canopy and she's got total control of it, she's either killed it or she's got it by the back of the head and the back of the shoulders, total control. She's not going to come crashing down to the ground. She's going to look around and find a really nice, quiet place that she can sit down and not be worried about being bushwhacked. And she's going to do what I call sailing. And I have people go, does she always carry like that? That's very offensive. Squirrel hawks don't carry. Carrying would be as if when I have seen birds that did carry, but it's because they were mishandled on a kill. But if the bird is carrying, when you catch up with the bird, it's going to go again. But if the bird stays put, it was simply a matter of she didn't have to fall out of the tree like a sack of beans and hit the ground. She could glide over and land near a bush and go up under the bush. Because when they catch something, they instinctively know that they're subject to being bushwhacked by either another bird of prey or, some kind of a canine predator or, any kind of predator on land or air, of which, you can typically fall into that category. When she's in that state of self-preservation where she has to decide for herself that it's safe to go down and turn her back on the world and start to pick at it. And so anyway, there's been times when a bird sailed with a squirrel that she caught and killed up in the tree, and I didn't know where she was. And I could sit the dog down, trap her sit, and I'd sit and I'd watch him, and he'd, panting with his tongue hanging out the side of his mouth, looking around. Then all of a sudden, she'd close his mouth, his ears would pop up, and his nose would start to wrinkle. And he would stare, and then all I had to say was, "Where's the bird?" And he'd take off. He'd be poking his head under all these bushes with that little tail, that little 4-inch Jack Russell tail, just a brrr, just a going. And then he'd poke his nose under one particular bush, and that tail would just go brrr, and it would stop. Well, that's where the bird was. So I called him my dogalimetry. I never used telemetry on red tails up until about 10 years ago. So for the first 35 years of my falconry, I never used telemetry. I didn't need it. I had often seen a lot of times, and I don't want to offend anybody, but some people get to where they use the telemetry as a substitute for discipline and management. The last thing I want to hear when I go out with somebody is, well, she's a little high, but I got the telemetry on her. That's going to be a long day, So, and my apprentices, I typically will not allow them to use telemetry during their apprenticeship, because I want them to learn how to manage their birds and not have to use telemetry. But when my health has deteriorated, of course, I'm legally blind now, and it's getting worse by the week. And that was the reason why initially I got some telemetry. But the telemetry that I use is very basic. It's an old tracker classic, two-channel pre-programmed with a row of LED lights, because I can't see the little needle. But it's all you need with a red tail. Red tails don't typically just go to the next county. They're going to be somewhere close by. And the biggest thing that loses red tails is panic. If you don't know where the bird is, stay where you are and listen, because if you start chasing the crows, they're cawing over somewhere and you think they're harassing your bird. She must be over there. She must be over here. When you're scared that you don't know where the bird is, everything sounds like a bell. Birds calling sounds like bells. Oh, is that her? So panic is the thing that loses birds. You start running around crazy looking for them. It might not end well.
Yeah, and you gotta learn how to read some of the environmental factors for sure, and that's always been the classic form of telemetry, before that was ever invented. But I know the one other thing too, and there's a few other things that we're probably gonna end up discussing, or you're gonna talk about or whatever. But the other thing that we didn't really get much of a chance to touch on the other day, whenever we recorded last, also was your role, and I know you had a couple of stories about, or one particular story about your role in helping to get some of the laws changed and stuff with the rules and regulations here in Texas and stuff too. I mean, Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. There's two things that I was involved in getting straightened out in the state. One was the car trapping with the BC. If you look in the Texas regulations, it's illegal to hunt utilizing an automobile in public roads. And that wasn't so much the problem as it was the definition of hunting, And one of the definitions of hunting was trapping or attempted trapping. And I can assure you that when they wrote that law, nobody was thinking about falconry, and I could tell that they had made some kind of a concession with somebody, because there was an exception made in that law concerning trapping or attempted trapping for herpetologist people, snake people. And so I knew it wasn't chiseled in stone, really, but something was going to happen, because you get out there and get pulled over BC trapping, because you're acting weird. You're sitting on the side of the road with binoculars looking at something, and the cops or the general public drives by and sees 2 or 3 men sitting in a car with binoculars staring at something. They're going to call the law, and the law comes out, and there you are. And, of course, back in that time, most of your game wardens didn't have a clue about falconry, and so you present them with all kinds of state and federal permits, and the vast majority of the time they would just assume that you were permitted to do that because all the permits you had and all the equipment, you couldn't be lying, or you wouldn't be carrying around, gerbils and, traps and weird stuff like that. So typically they'd let you go. But one year a guy got cited down in South Texas trapping Harris hawks, and he just paid his fine. Well, in the part of the world where I live, there's no other way really to get a passage red tail, other than BC trapping, or bachatry, if you don't know what BC stands from. Because you take the trap and you go look for a bird and you serve the trap to the bird from the car. So you're on a public roadway and it's a trap, so, technically, and that's the way the laws are interpreted, it doesn't matter that they weren't thinking about falconry when they wrote the law. If you get stopped, it's the letter of the law that they're going to go by. So, obviously what we were doing was illegal. And at the state meet one year, they brought this up. The the officers committee brought this up at our business meeting and said, we need a test case because we don't know. We don't know if we're doing something illegal or whether we're not doing something illegal. Because a lot of people get stopped and turned loose. And then we had a guy get stopped and he got busted. So if anybody in this club gets cited for BC trapping, call the president of the club right away. First thing, call them, And we had a falconry advisory board, which is the buffer between the falconry community and the powers that be, so that we didn't have jackasses calling down there and causing a problem for everybody else, by being disrespectful. Typically, veterans don't have a problem. They understand the chain of command and authority, and, we can typically deal with figures of authority a lot better than people who've never had to live a disciplined life. So anyway, I called the club and told them I'd been busted. I wasn't really the one trapping. I was a passenger in the car. It was a young man. He was 16 years old. He just got his driver's license and borrowed his grandma's car. Just got his falconry permit and called and asked me if I would, guide him around through my trapping spots. So I did. Meanwhile, we picked up another buddy of mine who lived in that route, just, come along for the fun of it, trapping. Who doesn't like to trap, So we were coming back down from Paris, Texas, near a town, a little bitty, tiny, dinky town called Cooper, Texas. And we had served the trap, sitting on the side of the road with the binoculars, looking at it, and just past the trap was a county road that came in from the right, and I saw a game warden truck pull up to the stop sign. And I thought, oh, crap. So then he turned left, going down towards where we were. So I knew we were fixing to get, shook down. So, and he was a young guy. I hadn't been out of game warden school for very long, I'm sure. It was on a Saturday so the office was closed. And really typically, he had a little bit of a difficult time believing the story that we're trying to trap that bird up there, but then we finally convinced him of that. And then he didn't know whether what we were doing was legal or not, so he led us down to a Dairy Queen and we sat there and waited for a couple hours for him to get back. And he said he'd go to the office and do some research and he'd get back with us for us to wait there for him. So we did, being the law-abiding citizens that we are. And he come back in a couple hours. He said, I got good news. I got bad news. And I said, well, let's have the bad news first. He says, well, I'm going to have to cite somebody. And I said, and what's the good news? He says, I'm only going to write one ticket, so y'all decide who gets it. So I'd been around for a lot longer than the other two guys that were in the car. So I knew a lot of people in the Capitol, Austin, in the bureaucracy that, governed our sport. And so I elected to take the ticket myself. And so then I got a call from an anonymous person that I can't mention their names, but they called me and told me that when I go to court, plead innocent, and if I'm found guilty, to appeal the case. So eventually my court date came up. And I had to go to Cooper, Texas, which was, an hour and a half drive from where I actually live. And so I took a day off of work and I went to my court trial. Well, the usual judge that would handle this was up in Wyoming trout fishing. And a local ambulance chaser was sitting in for him. And and I say that because I got the impression that the judge, had somewhat of a bone to pick with law enforcement. And so I felt like from the beginning he was in my corner, And I pled my case on precedent. In other words, that I'd been pulled over many times and been checked out and released. And this was the first time I'd ever been cited in all the years I've been doing this. And in fact, I brought out my book and I flipped over to a chapter that had some pictures in it of trapping with the BC and on the roadside. And I showed the judge that picture, and I said, this book is in the Texas Parks and Wildlife Library in Austin. Nobody's ever said anything to me about it before. And so I rested my case, and the game warden stood up and he opened up the big book of regulations and said, but the regulations say, and he read it. And I mean, he was dead right. I mean, he's, by what was written in the regulations, I was guilty, So the judge put us out in the hallway, and he went back into his chamber to deliberate. And after about 15 minutes, he called us in. And we sat down, and he determined that I was guilty as charged. And he waged a $5 fine. And the game warden objected. And the judge asked him what was his objection. He says, because the minimum fine is $25. And so the judge changed his ruling to $25 fine. And then I stood up and said, I would like to appeal this case. And the judge said, son, it's going to cost you $280 to appeal this $25 fine. Is that what you want to do? I said, yes, sir. So I went, and he told me to go down to the window, pay my fine, pay the fee for the appeal, fill out the paperwork. Well, now I was going to have to go before a panel. My next trial would be before a panel of judges. And it was about probably 2 or 3 months down the road before my trial came up again. And so I called the proper people and told them what had happened. I'd been found guilty and that I appealed it, So I was told to stand down and that they'd get back with me. So 3 days before the trial came up, I got a call. And they said, there's a memo going out to every game warden's office in the state tomorrow morning that you guys can use your cars as long as you do it, as long as you observe all traffic laws and do it in a safe manner. And this will be printed on the face of your permits from this day forward. So we're going to fax you a copy of that memo. You take it to court with you, and they'll drop the charges. And I said, great. So, I lost the $25, but I got the $280 back for the appeal when they dropped the case. And I considered it money well spent. And the other law was, when I first got into falconry, everybody had to abide by the state gun laws, gun hunting laws, so that means that you had to observe the designated seasons, the gun seasons, well, unfortunately the birds can't read, so when they're up there and they're loose and they see something that's on their menu and they don't think about the fact that it may be out of season, they're just going to go for it, and then, as to be a law-abiding falconer, if they kill something that's out of season, you just have to leave it laying on the ground. You just have to abandon it for the possums and the coons and the, vultures, the scavengers. So, it just made it very difficult. And Texas at that time had a split squirrel season where you had 2 seasons and then they were separated in the middle. And, it was all based around their typical breeding season type stuff. So, I had met the state biologist. The club had him up one year to give a speech, and I was able to have the opportunity to take him out squirrel hawking while he was there. And it was a great day. Everything, the stars all lined up, and it was just a fantastic hunt. He got to see, even in Abilene, Texas, he got to see some good squirrel hawking. And so when I mounted this campaign, every few years they take another look at the regulations, and they give the public the opportunity to express any needs or desires or complaints, that they have. They have these public forums all over the state. And, of course, to keep the tree huggers from filibustering, they have to limit everybody to 3 minutes. And the way they do that, or at least the forum that I went to was in Austin at the main office. Behind the Parks and Wildlife Board of Directors, there's a traffic light mounted on the wall. And then in front of the Board of Directors, there's a podium with a microphone. And when the green light comes on, that means that the microphone is hot. You can begin speaking what you came to say. And then when the yellow light comes on, that's telling you there's 1 minute left. And when the red light comes on, they kill the microphone, just to keep people from, taking advantage of it. Well, I wrote a speech, and anytime you want to change or try to change a gun season or a hunting season that involves the wildlife, your argument should be directed towards impact, because that's the way the biologists think. What kind of an impact will this request have on the wild population? Well, when I was a kid, squirrels, that was a big game. I mean, everybody hunted squirrels. It was like a popular sport. But these days, it's all white-tailed deer and turkey and largemouth bass. It's all the big stuff, the trophy stuff, And squirrels, there's just not that many people anymore that hunt them, And so, I had that going for me. But my problem was I wanted the season to be extended to at least to mid-March or late March. That's all I was asking for. And, because that's typically when we put our birds up for the molt. I usually hunt right up until April. And then when it gets to the point to where, you got to fight the mosquitoes and the wasps and the snakes and all that, it's time to shut her down for the year. So I wrote this speech that I could not get it below 9 minutes. So I got 2 other falconers who were also squirrel hawkers. I got 2 other falconers to go down there with me, and everybody memorized 3 minutes. We signed up in order. And then we presented our case to the board of the Texas Parks and Wildlife. And the biologist was there. And he heard the speech, and he met me in the lobby and shook my hand and said, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. He said, it may take us a year, but, it's going to happen. But it wasn't but about 2 or 3 months after that, I got a call. And the caller told me that what they had wound up deciding is that since the birds began molting in April, sometime in April, and we put them up and we don't hunt them through the molt, that really actually it was self-regulated, because we put the birds up. So why would you even have to have a law if this thing was self-regulated? If you didn't hunt them during the spring and summer, there's no point in having a regulation. And as far as the bag limits were concerned, I told them the best I ever did on squirrels was 5 squirrels in one hunt. Well, when I was a kid, we used to go out there and we'd kill 25, 30 squirrels, in one hunt. And, with the 410 shotguns and 22 rifles, and dogs. So, a typical squirrel hunt is 1 kill. A good squirrel hunt is 2 kills, and rarely 3 kills. And, but above that, it's just very highly unusual, So it's not like we're going out there and slaughtering wildlife. If we wanted to do that, we'd just get us a shotgun, be a lot easier. Not only that, is that they were impressed with the two other statements that I made in that speech. One was that there would be more squirrels killed crossing the street in one small Texas town than all the squirrel hawkers in Texas would take during that additional 2 months I was asking for, And then also I got the board to laugh when I said that the hawks couldn't read in regards to the seasons. I said the bird can't read, and they thought that was clever. So what I wound up getting was no close season, no bag limit for squirrel take by falconry in the state, which was way more than I was asking for. I was just elated. Look, if you approach people with respect and with sense, not just because you want it, if you can justify what you need to, people are prone to do the right thing. I believe that most people in the bureaucracy are just good, normal people. They have a job to do. Just like the game warden that busted me for trapping from the car. He was right. He was doing his job. You know what I mean? He and I were on very friendly terms before it was all over with. And I harbor no resentment towards him. It's not like the law and the falconry community are enemies, that they're at odds with one another. The law protects what we hunt, and so, we're all on the same team. That's the way I see it. And if you approach it in that light, not as at enmity with each other, but we're both interested in the same thing. We're both interested in the conservation and the preservation of the game that we love,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And as long as nobody loses complete and total sight of that, everybody ends up winning for sure. But I know we've got like a whole notebook worth of stuff, but I think that pretty well covers it. Those are the main things that I wanted to touch base on again. And heck, we've already got a whole other hour of good stuff. And I knew that those to me at least were some cool stories and some cool experiences that I thought would be important to share, mainly because, well, like the one that you just shared, for example, it's a prime example of how something that at least on the surface can seem negative can lead to ultimately something being really positive. And, not every experience like that has to turn out bad in the end, right. And sometimes you can facilitate good things happening by some initial inconvenience.
It causes them to relook at something that maybe, one other comment I want to make about the squirrel season. Mm-hmm. 3 other states contacted me and used that material that I had put together to get the seasons in their states extended. Now they didn't get what I got. They didn't get no close season, no bag limit. But they did get an extended season using that material, that speech.
Yeah. And, I know that our season in Indiana, I think it starts like somewhere around like mid-August, like August 15th or something. And it actually ends in mid-February. And I know personally, I would really love to see it go to like end of March personally. Right. But, there's always baby steps involved with a lot of it. And who knows? I don't know when and if any of that stuff comes up for revisiting and things like that. But you never, you can't ever get anything changed if you don't ask.
Exactly.
And so,
and I'd say one thing too, I want to put the kudos out there for the Texas Hawking Association, because, after the sting thing that happened back in the early 80s, there was a lot of tension between falconry and law enforcement, the bureaucracy. And the Texas Hawking Association or your state club, wherever you're at, you need to support your state club, because the Texas State Club spent a lot of effort over the years that followed that in trying to mend the relationships and strengthen the relationship between the bureaucracy, the ones that, govern everything, and our club, and through all that, the bureaucracy came to understand that we weren't just a bunch of kooks that wanted a cool pet, and that we were serious people and that we were committed to a very difficult, ancient practice, and that we were serious people. Everything from, in falconry, you got everything from garbage men to, powerful lawyers and politicians. Robert Kennedy Jr. is a falconer. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Yeah.
But, you can be buddies with somebody for years in falconry and have a high degree of respect for them and not even know what they do for a living. Because when we're together, it's all about the birds, and the hunt. And so, people of all walks of life, I was, in the last years of my professional life, I was a roofing contractor, which is like 2 steps above riding the back of a garbage truck, but the guys I rubbed elbows with and hunted with and who were my friends were, surgeons and lawyers and, all kinds of walks of life, because in falconry, we're no respecter of persons. We're respecters of practice. We all love the same thing. We fly different birds and we fly different quarry, but in the end, we all have that same passion, that we share amongst one another. My kids grew up around these grown men, that get all excited about a chase, and a kill. And then you got 4 or 5 grown men from all walks of life standing around with their eyes real big and telling what they saw from where they were standing, and, it's just a marvelous thing that really people that are not involved in it really can't really understand it. Only a practitioner can really get a grip on why they do it. I've had people go, "Oh, what's in it for you? What do you get out of it?" Shoot. I can't explain that to you. You got to experience it. Words can't do it. Mm-hmm. You have to live it. Then you will understand. Mm-hmm. And I also noticed that a lot of people, they first get introduced in some way, a movie or a magazine article or, some kind of a public exhibition thing.
Books.
Yeah, whatever. And they get all interested in it and they think it's all fascinating and they think they want to do it. But then when they get to down to the brass tacks of what really is involved, it's not a hobby. If you know a practicing falconer, it's not his hobby. It's way more than that. It's his life. It's part of his life. It's who he is. It shapes him and he shapes his family. And falconry has a big part in that. It's a teaching opportunity to your kids that death is a fact of life. In order for there to be life, there's first got to be death. Life feeds on life. And that's a reality. That most kids think that, meat grows on trees and wrapped in cellophane, they've never had to go out to the chicken coop and wring a neck, and pluck a chicken. But falconry gives you that opportunity, to have a teaching moment with your children. They grow up with a healthy understanding of the realities of life and death. We all respect our quarries. It's not like we go out, like I was talking to you yesterday about some of the best hawk and chase stories don't end with a kill. They end with a quarry species that we were chasing that just did some of the most spectacular things and got away, and you never forget that, you have a reverence in your heart, your respect for that guy, what he did to get away from an experienced bird, and birds that do incredible things, in flight. That's a great thing about squirrel hawking is you get to see your bird learn. You get to see your bird thinking and making decisions, and for instance, I'll give you an example. Say a squirrel gets into a tight spot where the bird can't get at it, and if you watch that bird, she'll sit there for a while and then she'll start looking around, and then she'll stop looking at something and bob her head. Then she'll start looking around again, and then she'll bob her head. And she'll look around again and she'll bob her head. If you give her the time, they'll come to a place where what she just did, she had formulated an attack plan that involves 3 moves. And at the 3rd move, she's going to be in an angle towards that game where she has a shot at it. And at that time, if you got to recognize when this is going on, because that plan is contingent on that squirrel being right where it's at, not moving. So you don't want to move it when you see her doing this. And then you'll notice that when she starts to move, she'll go to where she bobbed her head the first time. And then the next move will be to where she bobbed her head the second time. And then the next move will be to where she bobbed her head the 3rd time. And it's from there she's going to launch that attack. And when you start seeing those things and feeling the partnership that is squirrel hawking, when you're doing most other kinds of falconry, once you kick that thing up, you just become a spectator. You're kind of out of the loop. You just got your fingers crossed and hoping for her that she's successful at it. But in squirrel hawking, you really don't become useful other than a taxi service to get them there. You become useful when the game is flushed. That's when you become a factor. And you can take partial credit for some of the kills, because if you hadn't been there and done what you did, it wouldn't have happened. So that union, that cooperation, that level that you have with the birds in squirrel hawking is just so rewarding. That bird will never love you. She ain't got no friends and she ain't looking to make any. The world revolves around her. What she wants, what she needs. If she thought she could hold you down, she'd rip your heart out and slurp it down and never have a twinge of compassion or regret, because you owed it to her. It's hers to start with. And that's kind of a fascinating, aspect of falconry, if you want to get romantic about it, is that this bird you will never be this bird's friend, but she will use you. It's a kind of a, what do you call it? A symbiotic.
Well, it's the ultimate form of pragmatism.
Yeah. She's taking advantage of you and you're taking advantage of her.
It's what kind of relationship can I form that benefits me the most?
Right.
And that's like,
and you have to never forget where you really stand.
Sure.
In her eyes, anything you do for her, well, you should have. It's hers anyway. It was hers before.
Yeah. Well, and she'll let you know if you try and insinuate otherwise too.
Right.
But, well, like I said, Gary, this has been another great hour of good stuff. And, like I said, I think it's another good note to end on. I don't know if we can end on much of a better sentiment than these last couple of last final thoughts. And, like I said, I just want to say thanks again for, kind of on short notice again, being willing to come out on this Sunday and share these last few stories here. And, who knows when I'll get to see you again, but it sure has been a fun weekend.
Or if,
yeah.
Yeah. I've enjoyed just talking with you, and I feel like I've made a new friend.
Yeah.
So, thanks for coming down here.
Yeah. Well, no, you're welcome. And like I said, I appreciate you all and appreciate Randy for hitting me up and asking. Like I said, it's always an honor to get a chance to get these stories out to the rest of the world, and I appreciate you entrusting me with that. And like I said, we'll I guess maybe have another beer and talk a little bit more, and then I got to drive and fly back early in the morning and back to the grind, man,
Yeah. And I appreciate Randy too, because he, in my twilight years, he's taking good care of me, and he's going to be a force in falconry. I predict that.
Well, like I said, I mean, it's if nothing else, that he I don't know, for whatever reason, cares at least a little bit about you. Know,
we're pretty tight.
Anyway,
we're pretty tight.
Yeah. Well, like I said, no, this has been great, and thanks again.
No problem.